Um, but actually, I forgot to remind you that I was going to ask you who your favourite leader is and why, and what are their skills and characteristics.
Are we going to start there?
Yeah, we're going to start there.
Well, of course, it's Vladimir Putin.
Okay, no, speak about testing.
I think the last time you asked me, I wonder if I give you the same answer, but
I can't remember the thing that you said.
my favorite leader, my hero, would be Gandhi, and it would be. I did probably. So I mean, I think his main characteristics were just he had the amazing clarity of vision to understand that he could take down the mightiest empire in the world without lifting a stone.
Right. So, and I think okay, so he had the vision first of all.
Yeah, vision.
And he had the commitment.
Commitment, yeah.
And what was his, doing that is obviously a pretty big thing to have as your vision.
Yeah.
Starting from kind of like, he was a lawyer?
He was a lawyer. Actually, if you read any of his biographies, he was a lawyer in South Africa. And in apartheid South Africa, and as an Indian, he was a colored person there.
Right.
And his initial political education came, as an outsider in South Africa, seeing the injustices and fighting against them as an Indian lawyer, as a foreigner.
Right.
But I think if you talk about leadership, and I think this is probably as important as it is whether you're a dad or a CEO or the leader of a country, is Gandhi was human, so he made mistakes and he was sometimes contradicting himself, but he was in his actions perfectly consistent with his vision.
Yeah.
Which is
authentic is the word that comes out.
Yeah, authentic, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's very important. I think when I look at the people who I think are good leaders and good managers, people believe them. They want to do what they ask them to do, not because it's their boss telling them, but because they understand why they're doing it, and they know that he's not trying to do something. It's a little thing, but like for example, those of us who do if you're doing a lot of big M&A deals, when it's close to the end of the deal, you end up spending a lot of time in the lawyer's offices negotiating, sometimes all night, and very often we'll finish negotiating at midnight and go home, and the lawyers sit there and draft it. And a lot of people get into this mindset that the lawyers love to stay all night. And so I have people that I work with, and I see them asking lawyers to do something by the next morning, but they don't need the next morning.
Right.
And there's no reason for them to do that, except that they can, and the lawyers will stay all night and do it. So I think it's this being consistent all the way across. If you're going
but also I think that we talked about this in the previous classes. Is there's a big difference between management and leadership, and that actually managers manage and leaders lead. And one of the biggest problems, and it's one of the things I want to get to with you, is that one of the biggest problems is that people don't stop between management and leadership and understand. Because normally what happens is you start off, you're pretty good, and then you get promoted, and then you become a manager, and then you get promoted some more, you become a super manager, and then somebody gives you a leadership job, but nobody actually pauses between the management role and the leadership role. And so what happens in a lot of cases, and it certainly happened to me, is that you go through this process, and you take all the skills of your toolbox from management. These are the things that work for me in management. And you think, well, I'll just have to use them faster or harder or something like that. But actually, it's a different
totally different thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if you were to look at, so let's finish off with Gandhi. So what were his skills? I mean, he had this authenticity. Okay, that's a characteristic. But what did he do that was skillful?
Well, I mean, the most important thing he did, which is the sort of kernel of leadership, is he took his vision and conviction and gave it to all of India.
Okay, but India's got like 1 billion people in it. So
yeah.
So when you say he gave it, he didn't hand it one to one. I mean, one of the things that I talk about is how do you actually take what's this message or what the kernel is and actually distribute it? What were the routes that he used?
Well, I don't know if I talked about this, but before when there's this great movie with Ben Kingsley called Gandhi that Ben Kingsley actually won the Oscar for, and one of the scenes of Gandhi's life that they recount is when India was being partitioned into India and Pakistan. And there was all kinds of violence, and the viability of both of these projects was really called into question. And at that point, Gandhi went on a hunger strike and was literally dying in a square full of people. And all of the Muslim and Hindi and other leaders were coming and saying, Gandhiji, please eat, drink some orange juice. And he said, no, I'm not going to do this until this violence stops, until the madness stops. And it actually worked. And I was talking about this with some friends of mine who had seen the movie. And one of them said, the amazing thing about that moment is, while Gandhi's lying there dying, he was India. He became India.
Right.
And that's how I think he transcended, even himself, and got people to believe, like, if our leader is willing to, sacrifice so much,
Right.
this must be worth something.
Right. Now, well, hopefully, when we go into leadership roles here, people aren't going to have to, starve themselves to death before people take notice. So there's something between. Okay, so that was a very extreme case.
Yeah.
But I mean, the thing where I'm trying to get to is, he needed to create disciples. I mean, and in any, Christ did a pretty good job of that as well. I mean, in any of these situations where you have a message, you can't. Okay, you can go on TV. Back then there wasn't any TV, so that was a bit difficult. So the fact is that you have to transmit your message, and to transmit your message from my vision to a larger group. We can do it in this room. We can fill this room with people, and they can get our message. We could probably fill a bigger room with people and get our message across. But once you're getting into millions, obviously you can't rely on the people in the room, so you can't directly convey your message, and you have to create disciples that then take it on. And that's an important part. Isn't that a skill? I mean, that's a skill.
That's a skill, and it's also a tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
I remember back when I was CEO of Troika in the 90s, and with Bernie Sutter, who's one of the founders of the capital markets here. And I remember Bernie and I having a conversation at an executive board meeting saying, we need to be more aggressive about figuring out what our interview process was, because we had, we're just constantly interviewing people coming through all the time. And we very thoughtfully thought about it, and the way we felt about it was, 9 out of 10 people that we interview are not going to get a job here.
Mm-hmm.
But we still have a job to do with those 9 people, and it might even be more important than picking the people we bring on. And that job is to communicate to them, what is Troika? Troika is a safe place to work with. They're honest, they're straightforward, and by doing that, because 9 out of those 10 people would walk out of Troika and then they would go to UFG or Renaissance or whatever, and having those people pop up, but having had the opportunity over the course of a couple of hours of interviews to communicate this message, which we first had to communicate to everybody who was giving interviews, and I think that was incredibly effective in getting Troika to be as successful as it could be.
Right, and actually, I think when we deal with corporate culture, where, and you talk about, well, what is corporate culture? You start with you start with a vision statement, and then you have to bring it down. And then you say, well, how do you create a corporate culture? And one of the best ways of creating a corporate culture is actually through the interview process. You're talking about two constituencies. One were the people that you're going to actually bring on board, and the other was this, getting the message across to the whole market.
Yeah.
But the people that you actually bring on board, you've got to transmit the core culture of the organisation, and the best way to start is actually in that first interview process, right?
Yeah.
So, actually, while we're on interviews, because I did this with, as I mentioned, Ivan Switek on Thursday. It's got nothing to do with the current conversation, but seeing as how you mention it, in an interview for you, what are you looking for?
Well, obviously it depends on what the person is,
and what the role is.
Yeah, and what the I think, to be honest, the interview process normally fails before the first interview, because you don't have a definition of what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, if you have an organization that sells only in Russia, and you decide, we're going to hire somebody to lead our export business, and you come up with your list of qualities, and then you send them out. If somebody thinks that the export business should be in Asia, they're going to look for resumes that have experience in Hong Kong or Beijing or Tokyo. If somebody thinks that our export opportunities are in Europe, they're going to look for a completely different. So by not deciding the fundamental issue of where will these experts come from, you can't have an effective interview process, because you and I, if we have different views about where those markets are going to have completely different views about people, not because of those people's qualities, but because of our own convictions.
Okay.
But
so let's assume that that's done.
But on the interview process, I mean, I think it's a very non-Russian thing, but I always try to hire people that want my job. Because I think it's very important for them to be ambitious, and they can be most effective in helping me if they are thinking about, taking my place. It's a very interesting thing, because many Russian leaders hate being challenged, and so it's hard to know who are ambitious people. Some people will hide their own ambition, and particularly if they're women, and they think that it's not appropriate. So that's one thing that I look for, is I want somebody who is ambitious, who knows why they want this job, who has a plan for them to grow. I look for people who are good listeners. I think it's the most undervalued process, and and it can work the other way. When I used to go on interviews, it's a very strange thing, but if I went on an interview and the person interviewing me spoke for 55 minutes and I spoke for 5, I knew they liked me. Because those are the kinds of people that like to talk a lot, and I'm a good listener, and I can just listen. But for them...
Did you get the job?
Yeah, usually you got the job.
Right.
But again, it was, would you want the job at that point?
Right.
And then the other thing is I like to see that people have something outside of work. Whether they're interested in novels or ballet or theater or taking pictures or guitars or whatever,
And have a passion for it.
Yeah.
It's not just that, I've padded out my CV with something that I think, may make me look as though I have outside interests. It's that when they start talking about it, you feel their passion. It's not, and it's sort of, this is again, you want somebody that's real, authentic. You don't want somebody that's practiced their interview technique. So they've heard you say that, and now they go and look up stamp collecting, and you say, well, I'm a stamp collector, and be very careful when you put anything on a CV, that it's actually something that actually you really are interested in, or if you've done it, or that you can, because one of the things I used to do was if I could find something like that, I'd see how deep I could go.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, so you're interested in stamp collecting. Which regions are you interested in? Are you interested in first editions or used stamps? So, at least get into a level so that you're understanding, well, is this person trying to sort of blow smoke in my face, or is this person genuinely interested?
No, in America, I was a Russian language literature major. I love reading books. I'm always reading lots and lots of books. And in America, that's kind of an outlying thing to do. Most people don't read a lot of books. I think I read that last year of the college graduates in the United States, 43% read one book. So more than half of the college graduates in America did not read a book last year.
Wow.
It's a shock. It's astonishing.
Which is just shocking, isn't it?
It's astonishing.
I wonder I wonder how many tens of books a Russian graduate reads. If you could do a sort of similar statistic.
I'm sure you would find something like 90% of Russian college graduates had read a book last year.
Yeah, sure. But I'd say more than one.
More than one, yeah. But anyway, I was once giving an interview in San Francisco to a very intelligent young lady, and I don't know whether it's because I had some books in my office or whatever, but she said that one of the things that she liked to do was to read. And I said to her, well, what's on your nightstand? What's on the toilet next to your bed? What are you reading right now? And the whole interview fell apart. She was lying.
Right.
She hadn't read a book in forever. And I wasn't trying to expose her or anything. I was genuinely interested. And that's the danger, is if you express a genuine interest in something, and you find the person who can actually make that connection, you're dead.
Yeah, sure. And I'm afraid, part of your part of the process of interviewing is to shoot shoot the fakes. You really, and once that has happened, there is no rest of the interview. I mean,
Yeah.
at that point, you go into sort of a sales pitch for your company, but you're closed down. You know, because it only takes one of those,
Yeah.
and everything else. Now, what are you going to do? You're going to rely on whatever else they have to say, because you know one thing for sure: they lie. It's like if you have an affair with a married person, the one thing you know they do is lie. It's kind of like that. You've already got that problem.
Yeah.
So okay.
And the other thing I think that's a flip side that's a very important quality for me is curiosity, the desire to learn. And so, and this plays it out in different ways. You don't have to know the answer to every interview question. It's perfectly fine in an interview to say, I don't know, I've never done that before.
Yeah.
But but I'd like to do that, and I've done this, and I think I might be able to do that, because I like to tell people that my experience in Russia since 1992 has been, by and large, a series of offers for jobs I was unqualified for that I accepted, But for me, the curiosity thing is also very important, because we think that we know all about our businesses, we think we know exactly what we have to do, and so on and so forth, but very often the problems that you're going to have tomorrow are not the same problems, so they're not things that you're studying. Having somebody be curious and say, I don't really understand why these numbers are changing here, and it may not be affecting the bottom line, so you can easily look the other way, but the person who goes and says, let me just figure that out, may start pulling on a thread that you're very happy they did. So I think being curious is very important.
And how about the CV itself? I mean, the actual physical CV that you get. Is it important?
It's incredibly important. And by the way, it's very interesting. I have 2 CVs, and I have for years, because Russians and Westerners have totally different views of CVs, and you need to understand that. For a Russian CV, the first thing you say is your birthday, then you say if you're married and if you have kids, the 2 things that will never ever be asked in an interview or appear on an American CV ever. And then you go chronologically towards your latest thing. If you get that CV in America or in Europe, I think it's hilarious. Why do I care where you went to college? You've been working for 25 years, right?
Yeah.
So we have our CV will be exactly the opposite. It'll be the last place you worked, and then the place before that, and at the very, very end will be your university. The person reading the resume will get to the same quantity of knowledge, but when you are looking to pitch yourself to one or the other, I have a Russian resume that's in Russian that goes from my school forward, and then I have a different.
And what do you try?
But the resume is really, first of all, remember, I would say 2 things about the resume. One thing is, if you don't do it well, you have no chance, but it doesn't do anything but get you a meeting. So it's something that has to be, as close to perfect as you can make it, but your expectation about your CV should be that all it does is get you across from who you need to be across from. So one thing that I don't know why, but I always find typos.
Yeah.
Your resume can't have a typo, and you should read it out loud and put it under your girlfriend or your husband or your mother's nose. You should give it to everybody who you can. Just say, would you mind taking a look at this resume? Because you don't want any mistakes there.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm looking at a stack of 10 resumes and one of them has a typo in the first paragraph, that guy's not probably coming for the meeting. And the other thing is, there are no rules about resumes. People will tell you there are rules, but not as you go further along in your career, I often had at the top of my resume objective.
Mm-hmm.
Description.
Did you know what your objective was? I mean, so give me an example of an objective.
Well, for example, many years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, I decided I wanted to try to get onto some public boards. And being a board member is a totally different application than trying to be the COO or whatever. And so I had an objective of trying to translate my management and leadership experience to boards, trying to be involved in meaningful boards that were trying to create strategies, which is another thing that I'm very interested in. But it was a way of linking what was a resume that was not a resume for your typical board member with my desire to be a board. And so that's one thing I would say. about the other thing about the resume is, if you have weaknesses or holes, whatever they are, the person will see them. Don't hide them. You know, if you...
Oh, they want to come in? No, tell them it's the Bolshoi rule. They weren't here on time, they can't come in. Hi. Oh, have you been sitting out there for a while trying to get in? Okay.
So if there's something, you know, if you took a few years off, if you worked for a company that went bankrupt or whatever, you know, confidently put it on your resume, and, you know, be ready to speak about it. You know, as you and I both know, failing is a wonderful teacher, and so, you know, it's another way of being honest. But, like, don't think that you can convince the person not to notice that there's 4 years you weren't working by, you know, sort of stuff like that. Or don't try, you know, in the modern world, you know, my resume is the same way. You know, I have this, I'm in my 6th year at an X, and this is my longest tenure at any place.
Right.
And so I can't convince somebody that I'm the guy they're going to hire is going to be around for 20 years, although I could be. You just have to acknowledge that kind of weakness. And the other thing I would say is, for resumes, put, as we were talking about before, at the very bottom, after your university or work experience, you know, I think it's very useful to put interests, and to put no more than 3 interests. Because if you have 10, then it looks like you're just fishing for something to be interesting. But things you're interested in, whether it's, you know, fitness or mountain biking or photography or whatever, again, to give you those hooks. Because the most important thing in any conversation is making connection. And so give them a reason to make a connection. If you're, you know, if you love Renaissance art, put it in there. You know,
but make sure you understand. You really do love Renaissance art.
Yeah.
In case they do too, and then you really start.
Yeah, if you say, like, I love world travel, and they say, where have you been? And you say, Kursk.
Yeah, right, exactly. Right, exactly. Actually, I think there's one other thing that, you know, because when I asked Svetek, he interestingly, he said one of the things he looks for is why do people leave their jobs? You know, what was it that caused them to leave jobs? He said, what tangibly did they do? So it's not just, because there's this thing when you talk to people in interviews, they say, oh, I was responsible for worldwide sales of, you know, and then you dig into it a little bit more, and then you find out he was a matrix guy that was collecting information, you know, and actually had no direct responsibility. So I think you've got to, if you had a matrix role, you know, talk about a matrix role. Yes, I collected information, and I, you know, gathered stuff for the strategy. If you were the P&L guy, well, then talk about what you tangibly did. But don't try and sort of be responsible for more than you were. I mean, one of the things that I used to get really, you know, ticked off about was in the thousands, was when young Russians were sort of being, the thing that you looked at their CV, they were never anywhere for more than 18 months. You know, the thing that they were obviously excelled at was interviews. And you know, that they had, you know, sequentially, you know, got higher and higher jobs. But it was pretty obvious that they'd never actually acquired any skills along the way, and that they'd never really tangibly done anything, because they'd never been anywhere long enough to actually execute what they said that they had done. And so for me, this thing about what have you tangibly done is very important.
Yeah, and you know, the way I try to get at that in an interview is, I start by asking them about successes they've had at work, and start drilling down, and then I say, tell me about a failure.
Yeah.
And you can always tell, like, if somebody was really responsible for something, they failed all the time, and they can say, oh, yeah, well, I didn't see this coming, and I made it. And that's how you can really tell how much responsibility they had. Because if they're not deeply involved, then you know,
then they've never failed. And beware of somebody that's never failed, because it's not true. I mean, if they've been around for any length of time.
Either that, or they've never had any responsibility.
yes, okay, yeah. I mean, by the way, this is a really nice lead-in for the second part of this morning, when I'm going to talk about successful failure, which is my favourite topic. But and then there's a final thing in an interview, which actually, you know, I started doing interviews, the milk round at Oxford and Cambridge about 3 years into my career. So I was actually one of the guys that they sent out. You did like 10 interviews a day and everything. And one of the things that the city was good at was that they said, try and take out the chemistry during the interview. Because the problem is that, you know, in an interview, somebody walks through the door, and the problem is that probably, you know, the first 30 seconds to 2 minutes, you establish a sort of chemical thing that goes on.
Absolutely.
And then there are people that you want to have the job, and there are people that you're just not going to let have the job, and it's purely chemical. And actually, if you're doing the first screening, not the last, if you're a CEO and you're doing that screening, it's perfectly okay to reject the ones you don't have the chemistry with and hire the ones you do. That's fine. But if you're in the first screen and you're just getting through the hopper, the guys that get to the next level, it's not your role in that interview process to put your personality into that process.
You just to hire the people you like.
Yeah, I only hire people like that. But if you're the CEO, you're by the time you get to be the CEO, you understand enough about your corporate culture, about the people at work, how they work together, that chemistry part is a very important part of it. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess you might at this point be wondering who this guy is.
I would just say one thing more about the interview. Just to emphasize that my dad, when I was growing up, he had this book in his office called The Job Interview. It was written by Richard Fear. This first 2 minutes of any encounter with a new person is critically important. Show up on time, look nice, look them in the eye, smile, go through the niceties. As nervous as you are, it's absolutely critical to make a good first impression, because it's you never get a chance to make a bad.
You never get the chance to make a second first impression.
Yeah. I mean, the story I like to tell is, I like to play poker now and again, and a lot of people I know, and I usually just play with friends, but I've gone to Vegas to play, and a lot of people I know hate going to Vegas because it's all professionals. And the professionals are really good. They can tell when your heart's beating faster if you have good cards. And they're really great readers, and they're great at hiding their own things. But I like to go to Las Vegas because I'll play at a pretty decent stakes game, like a 10, 20.
What does that mean?
You put $10 in the first round, then $20 in the second. So on any given hand, you can lose a few $100. It's real money. But what I do is I sit down and the way they do it is they have one table that always has 10 people, then another one and they feed into them. And as soon as I sit down at the table in the first 5 minutes, I make a rookie mistake. I do something stupid that only somebody who is very distantly associated with poker. I'll go to the end and show my cards, and I have lousy cards. And you can just watch these people around the room. He's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing.
But you're doing this on purpose.
He's a Chinik, yeah. And then I play for hours, like super tight. I really know how to play poker. I'm good at the math. And you can even see them cursing each other. This idiot is winning. Yeah, because to convince them that I'm not an idiot, once they've convinced themselves that I am, it's very hard to do. And
but surely they're used to, guys like you coming in and doing that to them.
No, I'll tell you, there's another secret is, the most important thing in poker is to try to figure out what other people's cards are. And again, these people are so good. I mean, you see them, because they're doing moves on top of moves. They're like, well, normally when somebody's nervous, they scratch their, so I'll act like I'm nervous, so but what I found is, because they all know each other so well, if you're playing, and you can tell that these people are always there, because they want, hey, Stu, how you doing? How's the wife? All this stuff. So you can tell that they like each other and they know each other. So when I'm playing poker in Vegas, I'm looking at their neighbor, who's out of the hand, but notice, and you can see the guy saying, "Oh, good, here goes Stuart steamrolling another
stupid idiot."
And I know now that Stuart has no cards, because I didn't do the reading, but I just let his friend do it. So but I think it's. The most important thing is, remember, like, impressions are really important. And as we talked about before and this morning, when you never ever know when you're going to be sitting across from somebody again. Whether it's a negotiation, a presentation, or whatever. You may find 10 years from now, that some junior person who made a foolish mistake on a deal that you screamed at is now interviewing for the position that you want. So just keep in mind that the world is small and round, as you say.
Yeah, that's one of my sayings, is that the world is small and round, and you really as you walk out of one door, that you never know whose door you're going to walk back into. So always treat people well, or always treat people with respect, because if you don't, it will come back and get you. And actually, you'll hear from me a little later on, but for a big chunk of my career, I didn't, and actually it did get me back. And so I actually know this from personal experience. Can I just make a suggestion? Sorry, can I suggest to you guys that came in do you want to sit over here? You seem like you're a long way away. Do you want to come over here and sit over here? Because you seem like you're in the gods, you know. So just sit over here, and it feels a little more kind of personal if you're over there, right? Good. Now I feel like we're a family.
And by the way, the other thing is, you and I both know now, which we can talk about my job in a second.
Oh, okay.
But you know, all of the people, you know, when I encounter somebody new for the first time, if I haven't met them, the first thing I do is I make a few phone calls to guys or women that I think, okay, they're going to know this person, and I say, what do you think about this person? Right. So there's a multiplication factor for being, you know, trustworthy and good and an intelligent person. That really, as you grow further and further into your career, becomes more and more important, because you never even know. Right? I may not know that somebody called you up and said, have you ever met this Dan Wolf character? What's he about?
Yeah.
And you may not even know why they're asking, because it's somebody else who has met me and wants to do a deal, and they call their buddy, and their buddy calls you, and you say, oh yeah, I know Dan, and now you're going to say something about me.
Yeah.
And I don't get a chance to impact what that thing is, except for how I've been for my whole life.
Right, and then actually one of the things about this reference business, once you've been around for a little while, you know one thing. You know when you're asked, you give an honest opinion. In other words, you know, I remember I asked you about somebody that I was getting involved with, and you gave me an honest opinion, and it turned out to be very relevant. And you know, it's a what goes around comes around thing, which is that, you know, if people ask a reference, a verbal reference, and you're giving a serious person a reference on a serious person, don't try and make them look better than they are. Don't make them look worse than they are. Just give a real reading, because when it's the way you've dealt with that reference will be the way that they deal with references about you.
Absolutely.
And if they based on that reference they go and make a decision, and then they find out that actually this person that you've just said is terrific, you know, isn't, that will then come back on you. So that's sort of probably the next level when you're at the point where you've got those references going on. I mean, one of the things that I've got for EY, you know, I'm celebrating my 20th year in Russia, is that I've got, you know, 5,000 cards. Actually, I'm going to do a sort of installation with them on my desk, but I've got 5,000 cards of people that I've met. Well, they're not all here, they're not all relevant, but I can normally, if somebody's coming in to talk to us, I can normally find somebody that knows them, and that's, you know, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and also, you know, when you are giving and getting references, like if I go call somebody up and I say, you know, tell me about Stuart, right? And they just, oh, Stuart's great, he's wonderful. If they can't tell me a weakness, if they can't, you know.
Oh, that wouldn't be difficult.
No, but I mean, it makes it feel real, right? If you know somebody well, you know what they're good at, and you know what they might not be so good at. And as a person asking the reference, that's great for me, because you know, if they say to me, you know, like just for example, one of my best friends who I was a reference for, who got hired by this job, my old boss called me up and says, you know, what do you know about him? And I said, look, he is as smart and hardworking as anybody you will ever know, but he will never show up for work before 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, really?
I said, like, if you're good with having him do that, you know, he'll never be there before 1 o'clock. He'll never set a meeting at 11 o'clock. It will never happen. But you'll be happy that you hired Alfred, because he's amazing.
Right.
And, you know,
After 1 p.m.
after 1 p.m. But he'll work till 5 in the morning if he needs to. But like the point being that, you know, that for the referrer, if it's somebody who is frustrated if people aren't at their desk at 9:30 in the morning, they can't hire Alfred. Right? There's no reason to put them together. And if he's not, I've just done Alfred a great service, because he doesn't need to explain to his new boss, by the way, I'll be here tomorrow at 1.
Yeah. And if that doesn't work for the new boss, then it saves a lot of grief and friction along the way, because you've dealt with the issue. Can we talk about you now?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, we're 45 minutes into this, and you...
Who are you?
Yeah, who the hell are you? And why are we sitting here listening to you on a Saturday morning? So, I mean, let's do it the European way. Why don't you tell us roughly what you're doing now?
I'm the deputy CEO for Annexon Group, which is Michael Prokhorov's holding company. It's a very small company, even though we manage very, very large assets. And so the way that it works is Prokhorov is the shareholder. There's the CEO, Dima Razumov, who's my boss. And then there's 3 deputy CEOs, one of whom is the general counsel, CFO type, always running deals, dealing with our bank, debt and all of that. And then there are 2 of us, and they call us curators, curatori. And we each have a handful of assets that we're managing, and I'm managing our 18% stake in Rusal, where I sit on the board, which is the largest integrated aluminum company in the world. In that asset, we're not the controlling shareholder. It's Terry Pasca, so it's kind of a different role than for the assets where we own 100%. Renaissance Capital, which is an investment bank here and the largest investment bank in Africa. We're growing in the Middle East. Quadra, which is a power company, TGK4, and the utility sector is incredibly difficult. So that's Intergeo, which is a bunch of mining deposits in Siberia. Right now we're trying to raise $2.5 billion to dig the copper mine in Tivat. And then I also sit on the board of the Brooklyn Nets and the Barclays Center in New York. But I don't have to do very much there because my bosses really like that.
They're very involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I think you get the idea that he may seem like a charming, relaxed kind of individual, but somebody somewhere has given him some of the most relevant assets out there in Russia today to manage on behalf of somebody that's pretty smart. So that's I could try and make it real by how many employees are involved in these companies.
I would say it's probably like 150,000 employees.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that's a relatively big.
Yeah, it's big.
Management role.
The interesting thing about I worked at Troika in the 1990s. I was a chief operating officer there, and then I worked 4 years at Alpha, setting up a private equity business for them. So, and then one of the first things I did was I set up a company for Len Blavatnik. So I worked with a lot of these oligarchs, and it's a very interesting thing because they all have different management styles.
Mm-hmm.
And at Annexon, one of the great things about my job is it's just pure responsibility. They never tell me what to do. They're not really asking me what I'm doing. The job is basically to be the responsible person for the asset, to understand when I need to ask Dima or Michael to weigh in, or when I need to ask them for their help, particularly lobbying, and to be proactive about finding problems, because one of the big parts of my job is I want to make sure that they hear about the problems from me. Right. I don't want them to read about it in Commerçant. That means I haven't done a good job.
Right. And then you will get a phone call.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's interesting about my job right now is all of the CEOs think they work for Michael.
Mm-hmm.
None of them think they work for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't really tell them what to do because it's not really effective. I don't want to get into a conversation about you can't tell me what to do. So what I try to do is I try to become an ally for them.
Mm-hmm.
And as busy as I am, and I'm really busy, Michael and Dima are much more busy. And so the first place where I can be an ally for them is I can help them get answers that they need.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just an interesting role because I don't really work for them. They definitely don't work for me. But I have this authority and responsibility. And for all the assets where we own 100%, I can, if I say vote no, every one of our board members will vote no. So I can control things at a board level completely for the assets where we control. And they know that too. But I never try to use that authority because it's kind of a failure if we get to that point, I think.
But actually it's an interesting area to sort of delve into because I've always taken the view that in Russia, if you look at the different leadership styles, democratic at one end and autocratic at the other end, that Russians respond to an autocratic management style. I mean, down at the CEO levels, when I say down at CEO, I mean those CEOs, the way that they run their businesses will tend to be autocratic. I mean, it'll tend to be directional, and so you've got a bunch of personality types here that are, A personality types that are running their businesses in an autocratic way, that see their boss as being your shareholder, and so there you are with you're sort of sandwiched between big strong personalities and the shareholder,
Yeah.
and yet you have to create this influence. You just said one of the things that you do is you create the situation where they understand you're an ally. Presumably also that that they have been made to understand that you're important in their lives by the shareholder. I mean, it's not
Absolutely.
like you're just, because I would guess, because I've dealt with one of these oligarchs, as you know.
Yeah.
But unless the oligarch says, hey, listen to this guy, they just simply wouldn't listen to you.
No, it's a very good point. And one of the things that it means for me is because, for instance, Igor Vine, who runs Renaissance Capital, he's friends with Michael. He's known my boss, Dimitri Razumov, for 15 years. And I know that he may see Dima at a party tonight. He may have lunch with him this Saturday. So all this stuff. So one of the things that I've made part of my job description is when I see an issue where there might be a difference of opinion brewing, or when I have a strategic desire to implement something, I make sure that Michael and Dima know about it. And so Igor may say to Dima, Dan's putting a lot of pressure on me to put out a strategy.
Right.
And Dima will say, I think it's a really good idea.
Right.
I think you should do that.
Right.
And then Igor, this really happened, and Igor came back to me and he said, you know what, I'm not good at doing strategies, will you do a first cut? And that's what I wanted him to say.
Right.
But if I'd gone to him and said, I'm going to do the strategy and then you're going to comment on it, he would have said,
No, you're
you know,
not.
who are you?
Yeah.
But instead, he came to me. And so I think, I give you an analogy. The other thing is, as we all know, everybody has weaknesses and strengths. Some of the things I'm really good at, some of my managers are not.
Give us some of the things you're really good at.
I'm really good at negotiating and creating, a positive outcome. So, for example, when we're trying to raise money from banks, sometimes people, especially who are used to being the king and are very autocratic, especially if they're not focused on the details, they have trouble dealing with the banks, because you go into Spare Bank and you meet with the young people who are doing all the work, right? And if you don't know your business, you have no chance there. And so I can help them. I've been in meetings. It's a horrible outcome, but it's happened where I know more about the numbers than the CEO.
Right.
And so I can become a resource for them in negotiations.
Right.
I'm also a very strategic person. I like to think about things strategy. So one of the things that I focus on is trying to help all of these businesses have a strategy, have a view about what's happening now, what does that mean for a year from now, for 3 years from now. And then, a lot of it is, I try to be a coach. When I was at Troika, one of the things I did when I was COO, even though I was just ridiculously busy, was every single day I walked all the way around the business. Walked onto the trading floor, and here the same thing. I show up.
Mm-hmm.
If one of my CEOs, if I want to talk to them about something, I go to see them. I make an effort to pay them the respect and make their job easier. But mostly it's just about, I think at this point they all understand that, I'm not trying to undermine them, I'm trying to actually support them and help them.
Right. Let's break this the glass wall. Got to get through this. Because you see, the trouble is that I could keep this going, for the rest of the day, and I really find this question and answer fascinating. But I realise that there's some other people in the room. So, come with some questions.
Daniel, do you remember the time when you crossed the line between the management role and the leader role?
That's a very good question. It's an interesting question because when you look backwards at things, they look different than when they're actually happening. But even when I was in school, when I was in college, I was the treasurer of my fraternity. But I think when you asked me that question, I think the first time I really felt like I was a leader was when I was in college, and I volunteered to coach a girls' soccer team. And
no ulterior motives.
No. They were 13 and 14
Oh,
years
okay,
old.
sorry. I didn't realize that.
No, they were 13 and 14 years old, and it was a very interesting thing because they were at that sort of, they were still kids, and they would get in the mud and really but they were starting to be young women, so they would get all muddy and then they would get up and check their hair. But I realized that and our team was terrible. We didn't win a single game the whole time. And I realized that, you know, I had this, this role that involved, you know, because to these kids, I'm an alien, right? And I'm just part of this big mass of adults. But I wanted to make a connection because I wanted them to get something out of it. And so I think it's, you know, feeling like I had a bunch of people that I wanted them to follow my lead, but they weren't my people. And so I had to not only know where I wanted them to get to, but I also had to get them to follow me. And then, you know, I've been very lucky because having gotten here in the early 90s, you know, when there was really no management experience at all in the country, right? That you had the Soviet experience. And so very early on, I became, you know, I was running companies. And so, you know, my first real serious leadership role was when I became Chief Operating Officer at Troika Dialogue. You know, the company at the time was going through this interesting thing where when I joined there were just under 100 people. And 100 people is about the number at which you can really know everyone. It feels like a family. You know everybody's name. If you have trouble with the bookkeepers, you go back and you say, you know, Nina, I need help with this. And you know, it's a very easy transition. And we were becoming much larger. And to make the transition from a family to an institution is very difficult because everybody who's in the family who built this thing, who really are good people and are responsible for us having this opportunity, they bristle at the idea that there's a rule now, that they have to do things a certain way, and that there's a hierarchy and there are committees. For me, that was a really interesting place to be because I was brought in from outside. I was not part of the family, and I was driving this change, and so it became very important for me to embody this. They used to call it Duch Troika, the spirit of Troika, and it was a real thing. And you know, in order for me to get them to risk the spirit of Troika, I had to show them that I actually shared the spirit of Troika, which I think, you know, I ended up doing. So I'd say that was the first time I really felt like a leader.
But it sounds like you had this leadership thing inside you from an early age. I mean, it's like, you know, the
firstborn male.
No, but you can, yeah. But you know, this leadership thing came naturally to you. So, and then the question is, because I talk about this move between management and leadership, because I actually fell flat on my face when I went from one state to another. It sounds like you didn't have that sort of...
No, I've fallen on my face, you know, a million different times. You know, how to put this? I still find it frightening and difficult, and you know, I will lie awake in bed at night trying to think about, you know, how can I help somebody understand something I think is important for them to understand. It's a constant challenge, and so I know the thing is, I'm like you. I always say to people, you know, you can. The first time it's called a mistake. The next time it's called a choice. So, you know, making mistakes is a great thing. You should make all mistakes all the time. It means you're trying new things, it means you're open to new solutions. But when you make the same mistake over and over again, that's bad choices. And so you need to avoid bad choices. And I tell the same thing to my 13-year-old daughter, you know, make mistakes, especially when you're 13, make them all the time. But then make good choices afterwards. So no, it doesn't. It's always different. It's always dependent on who the people you're working with are. You know, the other thing I would say, I'm not sure there's quite a bright line about leadership because I don't think that you necessarily need to be the top person to be the leader.
No.
And so, like for example, one of the things that I find in Russia, where there's a weakness of Russians in business, is they don't understand that management goes both ways. And sometimes you need to lead your boss to be able to do your own job. So for example, when I was head of strategy at Quadra, and the woman who ran investor relations for us, Anna Krylova, she's great. She has some strength and some weaknesses. And I said to her, I said, look, if we get to the end, we were setting her goals for the year. And I said, like, if we get to the end of the year and you haven't achieved these 3 goals that we're setting for you, because it's something you needed from me, that's your fault. And you're lucky, because I'm easy. You can always call me up. I'm always happy to help you out. But just understand that, these are your responsibilities. You got to get them done. And that means if you need something from upstairs, you got to go and get it. And she said, very intelligent question. I love her this way. She says, okay, I get that. Well, what do I do if my boss is a jerk? What do I do then? And, I said, well, that's a much harder question. The easiest answer is make them think it's their idea.
How do I do that?
We were talking about this the other day, and I think you were saying that a good way to solve this problem would be to do this, this, and this.
But he's still a jerk. He won't listen to me. I mean, sorry, that's...
Look, when it's a jerk, sometimes you can't get it done that way. But, I think, I always, fight the good fight. I think it's done me very in good stead. So, I would go in, I had a boss who was the chairman of the board, whose favorite whose single management technique was to rip somebody's head off.
Mm-hmm.
So in every single meeting, she would tear off somebody's head. You're an idiot, I can't believe what an idiot you are. I mean, really horrible.
In front of everybody else.
In front of everybody else, and really not very nice. And as a result, what happened? No one would ever tell her about a problem. Like the building could be on fire and no one would walk into you and say, by the way, the building's on fire. Because she'd yell at them.
Yeah.
And if you were going on a one-on-one meeting, you knew it was your head that was getting ripped off 100%. But and as a result, she had to take decisions with limited information because nobody was going to volunteer, Yulia, that's not a really good idea, let me explain why, except me. And so it got to the point where, the general director of the company would be in a meeting with Yulia, and I'd be down the hall, and she'd say something crazy and stupid, and then he would say, okay, I get that. And then he'd walk down to my office and say, do you know what Yulia just said? And then finally I got tired of walking into her office and having her rip my head off, because I was like, Grisha, you got to do this yourself, man. I'm not the guy just to come in. But so I think,
But you haven't, because I think, certainly, I've had this problem, and I've had this problem sequentially, which is that I was never able to manage upwards. In other words, my problem was, and the more
you had a lot more of managing up to do than I did in Citibank.
Well, okay, but then it kept going. But my problem was that the more I understood my business, and I would hit I kept bumping into somebody who didn't understand my business, who was telling me how to run my business. And this was probably a lot to do with my ego, that I just couldn't, I couldn't deal with ignorance or lack of understanding from the guy or the woman that was my boss. And as a result, I didn't manage it well at all. And it sounds like that wasn't a problem for you, that you found a way around it.
I think, I'm not sure I found a way around it. I still have lots of conflicts. But, at the end of the day, being a leader means you have all of these things you're doing, but you also have your eye on the prize. You see the summit way out in front, and you want to get there. And, it makes it easier if you remind yourself where you're trying to go, to say, okay, yes, this person is an idiot, and they're not understanding, but I need them to understand. So how do I make them understand?
Yeah.
Breaking it up, that's one of the things, one of my biggest problems as a young manager and leader was I would be too emotional. And I was emotional for good reason. I really care. I want it to work out, and I care about the people I'm working with, and so on and so forth. But it could lead to emotion, and 99 times out of 100, the emotion is not helping. As soon as you get upset or angry, and there's the red in your cheeks, people are not listening anymore. And so, for me, it's, that's just to say, okay, this person's really pissing me off. And, after this meeting, I'm gonna go sit down and meditate for a few minutes, but right now, I'm not gonna let them piss me off.
Yeah. And actually, I want to underline that, which is that often, if you allow yourself the emotion, that you may have all the right messages, you may be completely on point, and you may know technically what they should do and everything, but they can't hear you, because what they're getting is they're getting the emotion, they're not getting the facts. And it's a really big problem of how you actually communicate things. And if you have, and I had a guy that worked for me when I arrived at Citibank in Russia, who he had ice water running through his veins. You could go in there and you could abuse him, his mother, his sister. You could just do as much as you want, and the guy's face wouldn't change. And he's ended up head of Citi in the whole of Asia, because he was in control. The moment that you have become, the moment you've lost that control, well, you've lost control.
Yeah.
And right from, this is 20 years ago, and he was wrong a lot of the time, and unfortunately at that stage I had plenty of emotion going on, but he would just never react to it. And I think it's not just in the giving, by the way, it's when people are doing it to you, to filter out the emotion from the facts.
Yeah, and they say in the West, at least, scientists will tell you that if you're having a conversation, 23% of the content comes from talking. 7% is the words. 16% is the tone, are you talking loudly, softly, and the rest of it is nonverbal. So really, it makes sense that your emotion and reading other people's emotion, like I remember when I was at Troika, I went with the head of sales and the head of research on a global tour to meet the biggest investment accounts, trying to get them to trade with Troika. And our chief economist and head of research was Chris Weaver, who I love and is a brilliant guy. But Chris gets lost in his presentations. And we would be sitting in a room of 5 or 6 really important people, and I would see that they are no longer here. They're thinking about other stuff, they're not paying attention. And I would just say, Chris, and I would just ask them a question, be aware of what's happening in the room around you. When I was at Alpha Capital Partners, and we had a couple of private equity funds, and we had some really talented young people who worked in MBAs, and really smart people, and I would send them for the first time to go meet a company by themselves. And they would always come back, and I'd say, how was it? And they'd say, well, look, they have EBITDA of 300, and their revenue is 900, and it's going to be 9,000 in 2 years. And they would go through all this stuff, and I'd say, that's really interesting. They know their business. This is their marketing plan. I'd say, what about the people? What do you mean? Would you want to be their partner? I don't know. Were they telling the truth? Do you like them? Do you want to go have dinner with them? And they miss this entirely, and I'm like, that's really, if we're going to give them money, the first thing I want to know is, do I feel like I can trust them with the money?
Yeah.
And so, we especially when you're, like you guys are studying and extending yourself, don't forget that all of this business takes place in rooms with real human beings. And sometimes it can be, you'll be in a meeting with somebody, and they're not somebody who's usually emotional, and you can see all this emotion. And if at that time you can say, is everything okay? And my mom is sick, and I don't know if she, and then all of a sudden, that little connection right there in a negotiation is the path to glory, because now all of a sudden this person knows you think they're a human being. And so, I think it's in all of these leadership things, some people don't lead by being nice, right? If you read Stephen Jobs' biography, right? The guy was not a nice guy. He was a different kind of leadership. But, there are lots of different ways to become a leader. And, one of them is the people who work for you and the people who you work for have faith in you.
Right.
And part of that is, we deal with, we have a lot of big assets. It's a really difficult time. We have a lot of difficult clients. We owe a lot of money to some of the banks at some of the asset levels. And it's important to Dima and Michael that they know that I'm going to be okay. That if there's a lot of stress or a lot of emotion, or if one of these difficult people starts screaming at me, that that it'll be under control. And that's important.
Yeah, sure.
From the perspective of age, would you say that first signs of leadership show up early in the age? Maybe according to your experience, you know people who aroused as a leader in 30s, 40s.
You know, first of all, I think age is very relative, right? You know,
We just had that at breakfast.
I'm 50, and I have friends who are 50 and they're still children. You know, I've known them their whole lives. I love them dearly, but they're kids. They never became adults. Forget about becoming leaders, right? They just they didn't have it in them. And then I have you know, other friends who are super intelligent, but they don't want to lead. You know, being a leader is not fun all the time, and you know, everybody says, "Oh my God, you have so much responsibility," and so on and so forth. But you know, being a leader means, you know, for me, and again, nobody ever tells me what to do, with very rare exception. But it means that if I have to fly to Lagos, because that's what Renaissance needs me to do, I get on an airplane and go to Lagos. You know, and that may not be what my wife wants me to do, it may not be what I want to do, but you just do it. And so I think you need to have both the capacity for leadership, which I think almost all people have, but then you need to have the desire to be a leader. And I think it's a difficult thing, because one of the things about being a leader, as Stuart was alluding to earlier, is you, like all other people, will make mistakes. And when you're a leader, guess what? Everybody sees you make the mistake, right? But that's okay. Again, it's a question of how do you handle this. So I would say some people, are not very well suited for leadership if they're not willing to work with lots of different people. You know, one of the guys, I don't know if you've ever done this with Mike Calvi, but he runs a business called Baring Vostok, which is the most successful private equity business in Russia. They've invested over $6 billion in Russian companies, returned many times that amount to their investors. And one night I was having dinner with Mike, and I said to him, "What would you say is the perfect private equity guy?" Right? It's kind of the same question, just not leader. And Mike said, "There is no such thing. Because, you know, private equity, we have to raise money from all of these institutional investors. That's a certain group of skills. Then we need to go out and find entrepreneurs, figure out who's going to be a good, successful entrepreneurs, and pick the right entrepreneurs. And then we have to exit. We have to find a way to sell our stake in these entrepreneurs so we can return the money to our investors." And he says, the idea that we could find somebody who could do all three things, even if all our businesses were in the same sector, but they're not. They're doing consumer and banking and oil and mines. And so I think for leaders too, there's a universe of qualities that a leader could have. And, you know, part of it is putting together this sort of nascent potential that we all have with desire, and then, you know, becoming a leader. And in big organizations, I think part of what it is, it's putting your hand up, like you're doing right now. I mean, you know, one of the ways to be a leader is to show that you can take responsibility and execute.
I just wanted to add something onto that, a couple of things actually. One is leadership. You just talked about how Mike would go through different types of leadership needed in private equity. But actually, and as you were talking about earlier, you know, the 100 people troika is very different from the 1,000 people troika. So the qualities of leadership over time in the same organization can change. When I talk about leadership styles can also change. Now, one of the things that people get confused is that they think if you've got different leadership styles, it means you're not being authentic. Because actually at the core of leadership is this need for authenticity. People need to believe you have to be authentic, otherwise they won't listen to you and you can't lead them. But sometimes, in certain situations, you need to rely more heavily on a certain style of leadership, and in other times you may vary it. But then again, you need this thing about consistency. So all of these things become somewhat difficult because actually the core you has to stay the same.
Absolutely.
The leadership styles you're employing may need to change, but they can't change Monday, Wednesday and Friday, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. You know, that change is not consistent. But if you are, for instance, in a growth market, in a stable growth market, it may be that you can afford democratic leadership style, and that works well. If you're in a crisis, the building is on fire, then saying to everybody, what should we do? Let's have a debate, and then the fire, let's get some consultants in, let's do a strategy review, and meantime the building's burning down. Well, that doesn't work in that situation. So the point that I'm making there is that when Mike was absolutely right, that you need these different leadership styles, but actually during your career, during the different economic cycles, you may need to be different types of leader according to the environmental context. And the other thing that I find very amusing, which is attitude to risk. And one of the courses that I teach is strategic risk, and I love getting a private equity guy and me and another banker on into the same environment, because if I've spent my life protecting a 3% margin, so my job in life has been, I want the capital back and I need 3% return. My attitude to risk is somewhat different from somebody who's in the business of getting 1,000%. Yeah, exactly. Who's very happy to lose a lot of money lose money because he's taking, he's looking for 1,000% return. And actually, then it suddenly occurred to me, and because I worked out, I wondered, well, why have I actually got quite a good risk appetite? Well, the answer is that when I was put into these crisis management situations, actually what happens in a crisis management situation is that as a banker you go from wanting a 3% return to worrying about 100% loss. So actually what's happening there is that your risk tolerance becomes different, because what's at risk is the 100% of the principal. And so your approach to business planning and the way that you're managing risk shifts, because you're no longer dealing with a 3% return, you're dealing with how do I save the 100% loss.
But I would say also, just to amplify this, people are very different, right? And just for example, one of the things that people have different tolerances for is criticism, right? Some people love to get criticism. Some people love it if they give you a presentation. You say, that was great, but I think you could have done this better, this better. Other people can't handle criticism at all, and you need to provide them with a different kind of feedback. This is where, excuse my French, but they call it the shit sandwich, right? You give them something good, then you give them the criticism, then you give them something good, because that's the only way they can take the criticism. Now, my choosing to be different with you and with you is not being inconsistent or inauthentic. Right. It's being sensitive to who you are.
Right.
Some people and it's a very interesting thing. I am an incredibly direct person. If I have something on my mind, at my first appropriate opportunity, I'm going to bring it up. It's just the way I am, and it works for me, and I'd rather have the fallout for overstepping my bounds than try to keep it inside of me. That doesn't mean that I want people to be that direct with me. People make the mistake of thinking that everybody treats people the way they want to be treated, and usually there's a huge gulf between those two things. So you need to sort of be aware of who are the people you're working with. Some people you can work with them for 10 years and never once say, well done, good job. And some people, if they bring you a copy and you don't say, well done, good job, they're going to spend the rest of the day going, I can't. So there's a piece of leadership which is about understanding, who you're leading.
I've just got to say, I've got a good friend who, a very senior guy, who just stumbled and fell. He actually went through a classic. It's not yet a successful failure. Actually, at the moment, it's just a failure. So he hasn't got the other side of it. But and I was spending some time with him, and so the entity that he worked for, as part of his sort of outplacement, had actually gone to the people around him 360 degrees. I mean, you do this anyway in big companies, but then in this particular process, they'd gone to people who had been with him and interacted with him for 10, 15 years, and they collected all this kind of feedback from everybody, and then they produced the shit sandwich, which was good news, bad news, good news. And it was very amusing to me, because we were sitting in a very relaxed environment, and he'd taken out the shit and he was eating the sandwich, but there was no shit in there. And so the only things that he was talking about were the good things. And I said, actually, my good friend, I'm afraid that you're missing that thing in the middle, which is actually the message.
The meat.
Yeah. And if you're going to move it from being a failure to a successful failure, you're going to have to eat the stuff in the middle. So that is actually one of it. And it's interesting how people deal with feedback. Very.
Yeah.
Yeah.
May I ask you a question? One notice. It looks like you look like our Prime Minister, Mr. Medvedev. I don't know. I'm the first to say, but
First.
So, I'm sorry, is that a question or an observation?
No, it's
Is there a follow-on, are you his brother? Or,
the question is more practical. If you would come to a kind of a new department, you would be head of new department, and you have a kind of a 50 to 100 people. What you would do in your first month? What is like from the management and from the leadership perspective?
It's a good question. You know, I'm a big believer in if you take on a new management role or leadership role in the first 100 days. You know, basically people will give you a certain amount of time to make an impact, but not much longer. And so, you know, I would be very conscious about this, you know, this period of 100 days, a little more than 3 months. You know, I think it depends on why you're coming into this thing. If you have a mature and existing business that you're the new manager of and you're coming from outside, then I think you can take maybe 3 or 4 weeks and, you know, take the time to meet with all of your people. You know, what are your goals? What are the goals of this department? And ask the questions open-endedly, you know, show an interest in the answer, because you can find out, you know, what are they going to do, and you're allowed the benefit of some research. If you come in and the reason you brought here is because there's 100 people and the P&L needs to be, you know, $250,000 in the next 6 months, or you're going to have to fire all these people, then you don't have the luxury of that. So it sort of depends on what you're doing. But you know, I personally would want to in the first, say about halfway through that period, I would want to come up with a strategy for the department, and I would want to share that with the people that are in that. And again, being very open to the fact that you may get things wrong because you're new.
Actually, one of the things, but I've got to say, one of the things you want to do before you do that is understand what is expected of you.
Yeah.
You know, and I've made this mistake before, which is that you can't make an assumption. You have to really probe what the shareholder is expecting to get. Because if you don't have that sort of frame of reference, and to the extent that you can, you know what their strategy for that business unit is, at least their view of it, what their risk tolerance is, you know, what their expectation, I mean, just at least you're aware of it. You may end up having to go back to them saying, actually, you know, this was your expectation, but, you know, this is where we can meet it and this is where we can't meet it. But at least get that frame of reference. Absolutely. Because you don't, without knowing what your shareholder wants from the get-go, you may end up go and do something and then you present it to them, and after 100 days they go, what on earth are you doing? You know, this isn't, you can defend it, but, you know, if you haven't at least had that conversation at the front end, it'll save you potentially going off in the wrong direction.
You know, and it's very interesting because, as I said, you know, Nexum doesn't do a lot of this sort of stuff that you get in the Western corporate. So what I do is every 6 months I make my own strategy. Right. Here's the 6 things I'm trying to accomplish in the next 6 months, and I do this for myself, and I send it to Dima.
Right.
Dima has yet to ever comment, you know, thanks for that, it was interesting, I agree, I don't agree, or whatever. But I do this, you know, first of all, I'm sure he read it, but it allows me to check my own self, but it also, it's like you say, if I go back to Dima, you know, in 6 months and he says, what the hell were you doing with Roussel? At least I can say, well, you know, I did. But I think it's important for you also to have personal goals when you're, you know, if you're taking on a new leadership position, it's perfectly fine for you to say, you know, I want to learn and grow into this and be aware of the fact that it's new for you, because you know, you will be challenged and it'll change you, you know, when you're a leader. The other thing I would say is be very aware of 2 things. When you start a new job, first of all, there's almost certainly somebody working in that department who thought they were going to get your job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be aware of that person. Usually that's a really important person to you, right? Their ambition is matched by their achievements, and for whatever reason the people upstairs decided something else. but be aware of those kinds of things, because if you can be proactive about those agendas and either bringing that person in, involving them more, you can actually make a huge progress in that. And
Hang on just a sec, sorry. And by the way, if that person can't be brought on board, you have to exit them.
yeah,
Because and I've made this mistake, several times, which is, I was aware of it. I knew that was their agenda. I thought that somehow during the course of the first 6 months that somehow I could bring them on board. It was never going to happen.
mm-hmm.
And actually, what happens is that they're the core of the resistance. They go up into the mountains and they then fight whatever it is that you're trying to do in terms of change, and they can be extremely negative.
Yeah.
So sorry, I just wanted to.
No, and the reason they're negative is one of the other ways I think about leadership and just my career in general is, it's about trying to find the maximum alignment of interests, right?
Mhm.
Any negotiation, any acquisition, any hiring, all of this stuff is about trying to get us as aligned as possible, right? And the biggest problems tend to come when you have a misalignment of interests, right? If going public is going to make the shareholder a ton of money and lose the management their jobs, that's a fundamental misalignment. It's going to be hard to get the company public. So what do you need to do? You can either share some of this upside with them, or you can create for them an opportunity that they understand that falls on. But ignoring these things, and when you have somebody whose sole purpose is to make you look bad and fail, they're no longer an asset for you. They're not thinking about how do we get on the summit, how can I help the team and the company and the department. They're thinking about their own emotional things. And so yeah, I think you're right. You absolutely need to be aware of that. But the other thing that I would say is, in your first 100 days, be cognizant of the fact that you don't know anything. Ask people. Say, like for instance, when I started working at Quadra, I really knew nothing about utilities, nothing at all. And one of the first things that I did was that I was hired on November 1st, was I did a strategy, because nobody could do a strategy, right? This is an old Soviet TGK, and they didn't have it in there. So I basically sat down and talked to as many people as I could, and I wrote the strategy, knowing that 40% of it was going to be completely wrong, because I don't know anything. And the process, when I actually did this, and then I met with the chief engineer and the head of the heat business and so forth, there were a lot of places where they said, this doesn't make sense, and I'd say, well, why doesn't it make sense? And they would explain, and I'd say, okay, I'm going to change that. And then there were a bunch of things, and they'd say, that's brilliant. Well, why didn't you guys think it's not a big thing? Why didn't you? Because we've been doing it the same way for 70 years. We don't think about it. But I think one of the things that has helped me succeed is people understand I don't. When I make a mistake, I made a mistake. Let's figure out what we're going to do about it. If somebody else makes a mistake, it's the same thing. I want them to know they made a mistake because I want them to make good choices. But I don't need to, rub their nose in it and so on and so forth. So I think just be aware of everybody's watching you to see your cues. If you have trouble with punctuality and you're aware of that, make an effort the first 100 days to be on time, because you set the tone. If you, so I would just say, just be very open to all of these kind of new experiences. It'll help you a lot to understand. And I'll say one of the other things. It's not a very popular thing, but I noticed you're doing it. And if I were in your seat, I would be doing the same thing. I always have a little book and a pen. You'll never see me without this pen. Probably if you see me 15 years from now, in a shopping center, ask me if you want to see my pen. It's a little pen. It fits in my pocket. I always have a pen because I write stuff down. And I write stuff down because it helps me remember, and I write stuff down because it helps me organize my life. I always look at what the notes I took the day before while I'm planning out my day. Oh yeah, I promised Stuart I'd write him a thank you note, all this stuff. Write stuff down. Write stuff down. It always surprises me when people come to serious meetings and they don't have a pen or a paper.
What iPads and stuff.
An iPad, doesn't matter, whatever technology you want to, but something to record it. I'm just, I'm an analog guy. But it always surprises me, if I'm meeting with the CEO of one of these companies, and I'm explaining to him what we want from him, and he's not writing it down, and usually I'll say, do you want a pen and some paper? You know, 'cause, like, I don't understand.
You know, it's
Especially because I'm writing it down, right? And, you know, so if 3 months from now we have a conflict, because you didn't say that, well, I said, well, let me just see what, yeah, look, I did say it, and I wrote down what I said, and I wrote down what you said. So, you know, keep this in mind. It's again, it's a leadership thing in that, you know, you're teaching everybody else. You know, understand this stuff, write this stuff down. It's important. A lot. You'd be amazed at how things that you think are crystal clear in your mind. A month or two later, you know, how much were we valuing that business at? You know, what were we expecting? You know, these things go away. And you know, I have things coming up that I did 8 years ago. You know, a company I was involved with is involved in some litigation in England, and I was recently at the lawyers, and they were asking about literally a contract that was negotiated 8 years ago. And one of the things that really helped, and I think is going to help give us some pops, is that I had notes, and I had emails, and I could say, you know, well, actually, I can tell you that what the other side is saying is not true, because I wrote them an email that said the opposite, and they responded that they got it, you know. So
I just wanted to make a couple of minor comments about what you just said. One is, I completely agree with you, which is why I do it. And by the way, one of the side benefits is that when you finish your career, you'll have 50 of these books, or 100 of these books. It's rather nice to look at.
yeah.
You know, I've got, you know, somewhere I've got 100 of these books. And, you know, I actually look at them, and there it is. That's my sort of experience. I will never look at them, probably. But the fact is that it's sort of a rather nice, tangible thing.
Your biography will think.
Yeah, no, exactly, if they could read my writing. The second thing I'd point out would be sometimes it's not appropriate. In other words, you know, it's absolutely fine in, you know, most of those situations. But if you're going into a you know, highly sensitive meeting where people feel uncomfortable that you're taking notes, you've got a sense that there are some situations. And then, by the way, if it is like that, don't take the notes. The moment you're outside that door, make the notes. So, you know, in some situations where people are very sensitive to it, you don't do anything in the room, but by heavens, in the car on the way back, or with the first moment you can, get it down on paper, because it will then crystallize. And it also crystallizes the way you think about it.
And by the way, you know, if I'm in a meeting like that with Prokhorov or Razumov, you know, one of the things I'll almost always do the next morning is say, here's what you know, a summary, here's what I take away from that meeting, and send it to them. Because I want them to say, oh, you didn't notice this piece? Or what about this? Or I'm concerned about that. It's a way of being very useful to them, because they're not going to take the notes, and they're not going to write it down. But also it's a way for you to make sure that you have perfect alignment. Because I might go to a meeting with Prokhorov on an asset, and I might not talk to him about that for a year. And if I don't take away the right piece from that meeting, you know, I can end up pretty far away from where he thought I would be in a year.
And that actually comes back, that circles back to the thing that we talked about during skills, which is how to run a meeting, which is that people in a meeting should never come out of that meeting with you not knowing what the agenda was, not knowing what the items were, not knowing what the agreed action was, not knowing who the person responsible was, and not knowing what the time frame is. And if they don't come away with those things, then, and particularly if you're in a change situation, you want people to be crystal clear that no, it wasn't a job for everybody to do at some time, it was a job for certain people to do at this time. And if you give it to the class, you know, to do this by next week, but there's actually no individual responsibility, particularly where you're changing direction, then there's going to be a lot of this. You know, hey, I'm sorry, but somebody else is going to.
And by the way, I'm 100% sure that if you or I are at that meeting in any role, if we're sitting at the meeting and it gets to the meeting and people are getting up and that hasn't been done, I'm going to say, what are the takeaways here?
Yeah.
And I'm sure you would too.
Yeah.
I can't not let it.
Yeah.
Let it, you know, it's got to be there. And I would say another thing that I think has been, you know, critical in my being successful, and I don't know why I'm a maniac about it, but like, if there's a meeting happening, I want to know what the objective of the meeting is, and then I want to make sure that the right people are at that meeting. And if that's not the case, it's a misalignment. I won't even go to the meeting. And my bankers, we were on a deal, and you know, it's very hard for people who are, you know, been in investment banks for 2 or 3 years right now because they don't have any experience. You know, the people who were in investment banks in the 80s and 90s, they were working on 100 deals at once. And only 4 or 5 would go to the thing, but they were getting this enormous constant experience. And they don't get that now. So, you know, our bankers would call up and they'd say, you know, we have a meeting within Doral, and I'd say, okay, what's the purpose of the meeting? And the purpose of the meeting is X. Who's going to be there? Well, those are the wrong people. So, and I knew this guy was like, oh, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm not going to go to the meeting. He says, well, what do I do? I can't tell them we're not going to have a meeting. And I said, actually, you probably should tell them that we're not going to have a meeting and get the right people there, or expand the meeting or whatever. But it's, you know, meetings that are not with the right people and don't have an agenda, they're wasting people's time.
Yeah, and as you heard right from the get-go from me, you know, business isn't about spending time, you know, it's about spending time effectively. You know, you've only got a certain, the most valuable resource you've got, actually probably the most valuable resource you've got at all is time, and the most valuable resource you've got in business is time, and how you manage that time and how effective you are creates space for you to do other things. If you're incredibly inefficient with your time, then you've got a 14-hour work day, and you're squeezing out the time that you've got available to pursue your interest, to be with your family, or whatever else it is. So the more effective you are, and one of the ways you can be effective is not to go to ineffective meetings, then it expands the rest of your available time, which is
and to amplify, as you move up more, you know, they say the work is limitless and your time is limited, and that being able to manage those conflicts is very hard. But what it basically means is, you know, the flow of information and requests that I get right now, if I had 2 companies, you know, Vexelberg, the people who are curators, they have 2 assets, and I have 5, right? It's just, it's an endless, you know, stream of this stuff. So part of leadership is knowing the stuff that's important enough for me to work on, and letting the other stuff go. Or trying to delegate it, or, you know, setting a red flag. But, you know, a lot of what you need to do as a leader is really make sure that you know what the 10 most important things to do are every day. Because I sit down in the morning, every single day in the morning, I make a list of the things I need to get done that day, you know, and it's following up on things I did yesterday, maybe upcoming deadlines, it's decisions I have, it might be a board meeting, but everything I got, I put it on a list. And I never finish that list. And I doubt that I ever will. You know, things get pulled onto the list forward every single day, and then maybe they get done in a week, maybe in 2 weeks, or whatever. And then I have a master list, which is more goals. But my point is just that making that list, which most people don't do, is totally meaningless if I can't then pick out what are the 3 things I need to get done by this day's end. Because if I just do the list, you know it's another thing, you know, one of the things that I think people get lost in is email. Like, some people feel that they need to answer every email quickly. And I'm like, you have just taken your priorities and switched it with your inbox. And given the amount of junk that comes into your inbox, why would that be your priority? We experimented at Troika for a while of having email open for only an hour and a half in the morning and the afternoon, just to get people off the email, because especially on the trading desk, you know, be on the phone, go outside, meet people. It's an important thing. But
well, and the thing you've heard me say, never let the urgent crowd out the important. You know, if you let the urgent crowd out the important, by the time the important becomes urgent, you haven't got time to do it. You know, I mean, it is fundamentally that important things normally take more time. Urgent things you can get done all the time. Makes you feel good. It's like sort of, you know, chocolate cake. You know? And you get through it. Makes you feel good. I'm doing a lot. But actually, if you're leaving the one thing that you really don't like doing, or that's really important, because it takes more time to the end, and suddenly then you've got to deliver that important thing when you've run out of time, because it's going to take more than today to do it.
No, and you've touched upon one of my other things that I think is important is I call it resistance. There's stuff that we need to do that we don't want to do. For some people, it's working out. For some people, it's focusing on their job. For some people, it's focusing on their family. But there's things that are important to us, and the more important they are, the greater the resistance. And it can be resistance because, you know, if you have to fire somebody, right? That's an easy decision to say, I'm going to do that tomorrow. It's never, ever fun to fire somebody. But putting it off tomorrow is probably a bad thing. So be aware of your resistance, because very often that can show you what the really important things are. You know, I try really hard to deliver difficult messages in person if possible, and it makes it much more uncomfortable for me, but I also know that it's really important. And part of the reason it's important is if I'm in a room with somebody, I'm getting a lot more information than if it's on the phone. You know, and but I would say just, you know, the things that you're resistant to doing, you know, if you're unsatisfied and you need to go to your boss and ask for more money or more resources, right? You're going to be resistant to that. It's a dangerous thing. It's a difficult thing. But be aware that that resistance can be, you know, problematic later, because you do push off the most unpleasant things. And I always, you know, laugh when I meet somebody who's, you know, our age and is a very senior position and they're chicken. You know, there's bad news to deliver to us, and they'll send their deputy. You know, it's just, I have so little respect for that. You know, or if you make a mistake, you know, raise your hand and say, I made a mistake. And hopefully you're smart enough to know that I made a mistake. Here's what the mistake was. Here's what I think we should do now. Don't just go with the mistake, you know.
Yeah, and as you'll be hearing in the second part of today, don't then go and do it again.
And then don't do it again.
You know, the slide that I have for that actually says, bang ahead here. You know, because if you do that enough times, you eventually get the point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question. Leadership is a kind of useful for energy. I mean, you use a lot of your personal energy to go with the people. But what is the source of the energy for the leader? How do you think? How do you just charge your batteries?
Well, everybody's different, and it's a really good question. You need to recharge your batteries. One of the things that's there's two pieces of leadership that are, like, one is being a good delegator. So one way you keep your batteries charged is by not letting them be discharged. And that can be by not doing stuff that's not your stuff. That can be like avoiding difficult people. And, you know, let's see if I can think of an example of this. Well, I would say whatever you need to recharge your batteries is really on you. You need to know that. It's very important. Part of it is not thinking that you're so important. If you're so important that you can't take 2 weeks of vacation, there's something critically wrong with your business. Because you're not building a team that can take over for things. What you're doing is putting everything on yourself and creating people who are afraid to take responsibility and afraid to lead. In fact, if you're a good manager and you like the people you're working with and you care about them, you want to put them in charge for a week or two. You want to give them that chance to be the leader. You want to give them a chance to sit in your seat. Maybe they'll see something that you haven't seen. So,
and not hover over them. Delegation is you don't go, you don't delegate, and then, you know, you're on the phone every day. So have you done this? Yeah.
But you know, so for me, you know, the most important thing in keeping my batteries charged is, first of all, exercise. You know, for me, it's like if I don't exercise for 3 days in a row, I can't sleep. My sleep gets bad. So, you know, I swim and I do Pilates and run, and you know, so for me that's a good thing. And for most people, that's a great way to keep charged up. I also 15 years ago started learning how to play the guitar, and now I'm learning how to sing. And I'd say there's been 2 great benefits from that. I don't think there's been any real good music come from that, but first thing is for my kids. I love the fact that they see me as a beginner and playing really bad guitar for 10 years in a row before I can play a song. Because most of the things that you could good in life are not things that you were born good at. There are some people like that, but most of us, we put in the 10,000 hours. And the second thing is, I can tell you, for me, if I have a really, really heavy day and I get home and pick up the guitar, because it's very hard for me, because I'm, you know, I'm a teacher and he's got me learning new stuff, in 15 minutes, everything is going. Because I need to give my attention to that. So something that takes your attention, whether it's drawing or ballroom dancing or tennis or whatever it is, but find something that allows you to be fully engaged so that you can turn off the constant flow of this. And the other thing that I do, which I think is very, very useful, is meditate. You know, I try to sit for 15 minutes every day. I have a meditation cushion at home. I have one in the office. You know, sometimes in the middle of the day, I'll close my door, tell my secretary not to call me in 15 minutes, and I'll sit down and meditate for 15 minutes. And I find that it helps a lot of that energy go away, because the energy that, like, you know, one of the way, you know, all of this emotion and all of these things that are taking your energy, it's like a river. And I think about it like, if you stand in the middle of a very swiftly flowing river and you resist, you'll be in the ocean. But if you stand in the middle of that ocean, that river, and you let the water flow around you, you can stand there all day. It won't even push you at all. But you know, being aware of these flows that are sucking your energy or making you unhappy, it's an important thing. And for me, you know, one of the things that frustrates me most is people who are irresponsible. And I have some of those who work in the companies that I work for, and it really makes me angry and upset. And when I'm feeling that anger, the thing I try to think to myself is, I don't want to give this person control over my emotions. And being able just to say, you know, he's making me, I'm angry about that, but I'm not going to let that anger rule me right now. It's a good thing. And for me, meditation allows me to just turn that stuff right off.
And with respect, you've missed one very important way of recharging your batteries, which I know you're good at, which is to have a wide group of friends, nothing to do with the business that you're in, and to enjoy their company. And then if you have kids, it's even better.
Yeah.
But the fact is that actually changing the subject, changing the input, changing the agenda. None of your friends, you know, I've made it a point to try and make my social network as wide as possible, because it's hugely beneficial. First of all, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Secondly, you're not going to go and hang out with somebody that's a musician or an artist and start talking about your problems at work. Or if you do, they're not going to be your friend for you. You know? So the fact is that if you can build a broad network of outside of your area of expertise, it's a wonderful cushion. It's a wonderful counterbalance, because they're not. It doesn't matter to them that you're some big wig in business. I mean, it shouldn't. It matters to them that, you know, you're a pleasant guy. You've got, you know, something to talk about. You're interested in their lives, and you get to participate in what they're doing. You know, how terrific is that? And I know you do that. So you just got to say that.
And also, you know, it goes to your point of authenticity.
Yeah.
You know, if you pick a group of authentic friends, it gives you enormous, you know, amounts of interesting tools. Like, everybody has, you know, the one friend who is very quiet and soft-spoken, but when they speak, everyone listens, right? That's a talent. What does that teach you? It teaches you don't need to be the loudest voice to be the one that's heard. You know, we all have friends who are really funny and can tell a great joke. Learn how to tell a couple of great jokes. It's an amazing skill, and it will really help you, because in business, especially in an Eastern country like Russia, or anytime in Asia and so forth, the person, you know, you may spend 8 hours at a negotiation, and then a lot of times you go out and have dinner. That dinner is important, right? Because the connection that they feel with you as a human being makes it easier the next morning when you have a gap and you're trying to negotiate the gap. That, you know, so I would say this is a really important.
Yeah, and you just touched on humour, and I've said it to you guys before, which is that humour is a great. It almost immediately releases stress. I mean, it's not appropriate in the in the 11th hour of negotiation. You go, hang on, let me tell you the story about the elephant. You know, that isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about, you know, injecting into moments that are appropriate some levity, so that it's because life is heavy enough as it is.
Yeah.
We're beginning to run out of time, because I'd said to Dan that
successfully fail.
Well, I've got to fail successfully in a minute, but we've got another few minutes, so we've got like 10 minutes. Yes.
Okay, so you work in financial institutions like Troika Renaissance, and you work in the industry. So can you tell me maybe a bit about the differences of corporate culture in these two sectors?
Sure.
Or maybe you could tell something about differences in Troika and Renaissance, like what it looks
Sure.
like.
Every place has a culture, and it's important to understand it. I would say that in Russia you really have, the Soviet legacy companies like TJK4 Quadra, right? What we call Sovkovia company. That's a different culture, right? And you know how you know this? Because it's Larisa Albertovna and Yuri Vladimirovich. You can tell, and they're like, I can tell you, like at Quadra, where there were 15,000 employees, and I was the only foreigner. Being able to understand that, you got to know the otchestva, and you should use the otchestva. So there's, and that stuff is important. In the utilities business, people wear ties. So when I go to Quadra, I wear a tie. These things are there. Culture Renaissance now is very different than the culture Renaissance when it was started, because it was started by 5 very successful and powerful people: Boris Jordan, Stephen Jennings, Richard Dietz, and Anton Kudryshov, and Lenin, and they were. In Wall Street, you get a lot of this. It was very successful people not being very nice at all. You might get the knife in the back at any time, and incredibly aggressive. They did things that we at Troika would never have done, right? And Troika was kind of a unique institution because Ruben Vardanyan, who was my partner and the founder, it was important to him, the whole spirit piece of it. And so during the crisis in 1998, in investment banks, people have the sense that they get paid a lot of money, but they get paid a lot of money when you have big profits. And after the crisis in 1998, I would have, when I was literally working 16 or 18 hours a day, I would have people come into my office and say, Dan, I need you to lower my salary. And I'd say, Anton, get out of my office, I'm really busy. No, you need to lower my salary. And I said, look, Anton, you're getting a teeny tiny salary, and trust me, there'll be no bonus this year, so just consider that I've lowered your salary. No, if you don't lower my salary, I'll quit. That was how people, there was a love for Troika that was kind of a bizarre anomaly, I think, in the business world. And it was something that we worked a lot on. We spent a lot of time, doing it, and I think it was, myself, Ruben, Bernie Sucher, Pavel Tapluk, and Andrei Movchan, we all really cared about the place too, and so, I think that mattered. But I think the industrial companies, it's a very different business, because if you're pulling metals out of the ground, or if you're putting energy into the grid, the predictability of what you're going to do, we know exactly how many tons of aluminum or bauxite we're going to mine every month. We don't know what the price is going to be, but so it's a different kind of management in that your strategic thinking is 10 years, 15 years, right? Right now the price of aluminum is low. Well, what do we think the price of aluminum is going to be, higher or lower in 5 or 6 years? Because we have a 3-year, investment cycle. So those businesses tend to be much more technical and much more driven by physics. The financial institutions business is, your business is, your company every day at 9 o'clock walks right out the front door. And so the assets you're managing are very different. It's much easier to understand how much this machine is going to, punch aluminum plates. It's much harder to know how much is this investment banker going to bring me in 2 years. And so your engagement has to be much deeper and on a much more personal level to sort of understand, what's going on. So I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah.
Yes. How it happens that you switch your career to industry, and what do you think is more interesting for you, to work in industry or in finance?
Don't forget, he's still got a finance business, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
so it's,
Yeah. But, look, I think at a certain point, right, when you are a very senior manager, you're managing people. Whether it's an aluminum company or a basketball team or an investment bank or an insurance company, you know, you're managing. You know, they say if you have more than 5 people reporting to you, and that's the U.S. Department of Defense, Pentagon, then you can't do it. So the fact that what's underneath these people is industry or finance is less relevant to me, because for me, my job is to try to make sure they have a strategy that we agree with, that my shareholder agrees with, that they have the resources that they need to execute that strategy, and then the rest of it is to make sure, do they have the right people around them, what's going on with them personally. You know, as over time, you know, you can see when, like everybody else, somebody gets into a funk and they're not that interested, and that's a really important time for me to engage. Why are they disappointed? Do they think something bad's going to happen? Are they just tired? Are they looking for the exit? You know, and again, it doesn't really matter whether that's Rusal or Intergeo or Renaissance. My job is to make sure that, you know, these people have a strategy and that they're following the strategy and that they're resourced and that they're happy. And if I can make sure that that full thing, they're fully engaged on those levels, then we'll be successful. And you know, I'll tell you a quick story. When I started at Troika, I was the COO. We did not have a CFO until 1999, and which was fine. We had a very good finance director, Tatiana Sigurova, who's now CFO of Goldman in Russia. And she came to me one day and she said, you know, Dan, we have, it was not IFRS, but it was US GAAP. We've got US GAAP accounts and you have to negotiate this. And I was mortified because, to be honest, I didn't even know what a balance sheet was or a P&L. I didn't know there was a cash flow statement. And she said, it's okay, we've done most of the work, we've got it covered, but really you need to negotiate this. And I was a little bit surprised too, because I thought, you know, I thought an audit was like a chemistry equation, right? You put the numbers in and there's the answer. But it turns out that an audit is a negotiation, and it's a really unfair negotiation, because if I'm running my company well, I know everything, and they only know what they find. And anyway, this was one night, the night before we were going to have our kickoff meeting with Arthur Anderson, which you guys probably never heard of. Used to be a big thing. And at 10 o'clock, I closed my door and I said, okay, I'm going to figure these things out. You know, how hard could it be? So I took the draft IFRS account and I was going through it, and at like 2 or 3 in the morning, I just kind of gave up. There was a couple things I couldn't understand. And the next morning, I was sitting in a conference room and there were 5 people from Arthur Anderson and 5 people from our finance department. And I said, before we get started, I was looking at these financials last night and I have a question. It might be a stupid question, but I'd just be more comfortable if we dealt with this. And I said, I don't understand how these 2 numbers relate to each other. And it was completely silent. And it was completely silent for like 90 seconds, which felt like a half hour. And I'm thinking, I've just asked a kindergarten question, right? I've just asked like the stupidest question possible. I've completely given up my authority here. And it was uncomfortable for me. And then finally, the youngest person from our finance department said, in a very soft voice, I think it's a mistake. And I said, yep, it's a mistake. And at that moment, I realized, you know, I found a mistake. So I can do this, right? I mean, these are the people who do this stuff. I don't think I'm an accountant, and Lord knows I would never try to put together a balance sheet myself. But my point is that when you change it to something new, it's like mistakes. People are always happy to explain to you. You know, if you go down, I started running Quadra. I went down to the chief engineer, and I said, can we have lunch? And I said to him, tell me how a power station works. It was like Christmas for him. He was like, oh yeah, let me explain this to you. And he was happy to explain it. Now, if I ask him every week for the first 6 weeks, how does a power station work, I'm not going to be doing very well, but people are always happy to answer your questions. And they're always pleased when you're curious about it. And so when you move into something new, it's a great opportunity if you're not afraid, if you're curious, because you're going to ask a lot of questions that they should have asked themselves, but they didn't, because when you're in it every day, you get locked into a mindset. And that mindset is, well, we've been doing it this way for 20 years. And if you come in from outside and say, there might be a different way to do that. Yeah, half the time you'll be wrong because you won't get the physics or whatever. But a lot of times people say, that's an interesting idea. We haven't really thought about that. Maybe we can do that. And so, and the flip side of that is, one of the things that bugged me at Quadra was they would make plans, like the general chief engineer can say, we need to buy some Gidra Mufti. Okay, why do you think that? Well, they'll make the station work better. And one of my things was, and I was just like a broken record for 2 years, was we don't buy anything unless you can show me what the net present value of it is. And it got to the point now where the chief engineer would say, we need some Gidra Mufti, and we're going to put together an NPV for you, Dan. Right? But the thing is, because I had gone to him and explained to him and asked him to explain the station, he said to me, let me take you to lunch. He says, Dan, can you explain to me what NPV is?
Right.
And it's not embarrassing that he doesn't know. It's a perfect thing. So being open to getting information will open you up as a resource for them. And those are the most productive conversations, because when the light went on in his head, when Kostin started understanding, all kinds of ideas. Like he called me up and he said, we have this big pipe in Rizan, and it's very leaky. It's going to be way too expensive to repair it or replace it, and it's a dangerous thing. It could break. Let's give it to the city. And we did. And now the city has to pay for it. But it's only because when the light went on in his head that there's supposed to be value coming from these assets. For him, it was all, he was trying to figure out what's the most effective way to get a gigacalorie of heat to this apartment building. Now all of a sudden, he's trying to figure out how can I do that in a way that makes us money. It's a totally different world. And so, whenever anybody gives you something, I've been very lucky. I told you guys earlier, like I've been offered a series of jobs for which I was technically unqualified, but I always said yes. But with the caveat, like as you said, that people share expectations. Say to the person who's hiring you for this, I'm up for this, I really want this, I've never done this before. It's okay. They know that, but you can acknowledge it and you can open yourself up again to having a little bit more runway.
I know that. See, we could stay here for 4 hours. The problem is that Dan has other things that he needs to do today, and the fact that he's spent 2 hours with us, and the fact that you're all completely in the room, and that you have really demonstrated what a masterclass is. I'm sitting here. I could sit here for another 2 hours listening to you. So I really want to thank you, Dan,
My pleasure.
and for communicating so very clearly. Thank you. And luckily it's on film, so the fact that you didn't take notes all the way through, it's okay, you can watch the film.
And through Stuart, you can always find me. If you have questions or other things. I think we're in a very difficult time in Russia's evolution as an economy and as a civil society and all this stuff. And I think the most important thing is that you guys continue to lead and fight wherever you are. It's a really important time. Those of us who have been here for so long, we love this place and we want to see it succeed. And we know that it won't succeed because dinosaurs like us are roaming the earth. It's going to succeed because you guys step up and become leadership. It's an amazing thing that will be unstoppable as we go forward. The passion and hunger that people bring to their businesses and entrepreneurial pursuits is the most transformative thing in the entire world. And it doesn't matter whether you're in America or France or Russia, there's always going to be turkeys, in politics making things difficult. But the entrepreneurial spirit is such a powerful thing. So, just keep believing. It's going to be, I think, a tough year or two, but I have a feeling that we're about to, embark on a new kind of Russian economy, partly because we are dinosaurs and we need to be
Time for us
embraced.
to exit, yeah. Dan, thank you very much. Let's take a 20-minute break. Well, you know, come on, what's your reaction to Dan? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. Any comments?
He's very professional.
Very, very professional. What else would you say about the guy? Well, what did you take away as, you know, what did you see there? Honest, direct, authentic. Yeah. You know, he talked about his strengths, he talked about his weaknesses, he was completely open. He didn't have an agenda. I mean, he wasn't spinning a particular goal, he wasn't, you know, that wasn't his point of being here. He genuinely wanted to pass on his experience. Any other comments about what we just heard?
He's very experienced. I mean, for every theoretical thing, he has a practical experience. So he every time could give some examples.
Yeah.
On any situation.
Yeah, I didn't get him into his academic background. He's a very smart guy, you know, and he's been to all the, the sort of raw material that he had to work with was of very, very high quality. But it would have, you know, sorry. Yeah, you can come in. I don't understand what the deal is. Yeah, sorry. You know, yeah, cool. You know, but the point I'd make is that actually all that intellectual firepower wouldn't mean anything if it wasn't combined with that character. So the thing that's made him as successful as he is, and he is extremely successful, is that those core values that he's got, that he was talking about, it's the way that he has interacted with people all along the way. I mean, I've known this guy for 20 years, and what you got was what he's been for 20 years. He hasn't changed at all as he's sort of moved up in his roles. He's just remained completely authentic. So I was glad to have that to share with you. And I actually think that because I can only call in these sort of favours, as it were, you know, sort of once in a course, because if I did it every one of our sessions, I'd run out of CEOs because their time is somewhat limited. But you know, I do think getting a third party in here is a very useful thing. So this is sort of like the finale of what I've been talking about, and this is to me one of the most important sessions, because this is something that I feel very personally, that I could have dealt with somebody talking about when I started in business, but they didn't. And I think a lot of people you'll read a lot of books, and a lot of people will talk to you about how to be successful, because that's what you want to be. But Dan will talk about it, I'll talk about it now. You know, it's extremely rare. I would say it's impossible for you to go from where you are now to a position of leadership and success without failure. So I'm going to talk about my personal circumstances and how it's affected me. And this isn't a shrink session. You're not my shrinks. You know, I'm not trying to offload some sort of fundamental character flaws. I'm talking about this because I hopefully will get across some of the learning points. So if I was to do my, you know, when we first met, I ran you through my resume, right? And my resume looks sort of, you know, pretty good. I mean, it's 25 years at Citibank, 11 countries. Then I'm a Delta Bank advisor, become the chairman. I start a fashion company. I become the designate chairman for Hodorkovsky. I'm the head of the bank for Soyuz, and then HSBC, successful. And so you read through all of this, and I was made, you know, Banker of the Year 4 times. What a success, right? Except this isn't the way life is. I mean, this is one version of life. This is the way, and actually, when we were talking about the interview process, if I was going for an interview now, I did actually go through a senior interview in February. And I've learned enough now that I didn't try and present this in the way it looks chronologically. Because if you look at this chronologically, you'd say, well, this is a guy that has gone from one success to another, he's built his career, what a wonderful thing. But actually, I made sure when I was talking to these very senior people about a very senior job, that I spent time talking about where I'd failed, what had happened, what I'd learned from that failure, and how it had changed me. And so the resume that you have, when you've gone through your careers, hopefully, you know, looks better than this. You know, I hope you all become chairman of multinational companies if you want to be. As Dan says, leadership is. I don't think people should aspire to it just because it sounds like a good idea. I think if it suits your character, if it suits, you know, your ambition, that's fine. But it's also perfectly fine to not need to be the leader, because it doesn't suit everybody. Anyway, so this is how I'd sell it, you know, and lost 5 jobs. Now you see, you know, you can get through this bit, but I actually, when I say I lost 5 jobs, I don't mean, I really lost the job. There was no, was I ever hired from one job into another? Well, Citibank stopped, and I was nowhere. I had no job. Actually, it was a terrible year. So I think I've told you before. It was a year that I got divorced. I didn't have a home. Didn't have a job. The 25-year career had stopped, and I was actually I was looking over into the abyss. There was nothing there. So that was job number 1. Delta Bank, it stopped. A new CEO came in. I was the chairman. They had a business plan. The business plan was that they were going to spend all our money, but they were going to build their market share to the point where they could be bought by GE money. They didn't know who they were going to be bought by. I represented the US government through the US Russia Fund, and I couldn't accept, because I knew my role as chairman was to act as corporate governance. And I said to the new CEO, which is Sasha Grigoriev, who went on to run Ingerstrike, I said, look, this business plan says that in 18 months you're going to run out of money. So if I sign off on this, this is like driving the bus towards the cliff, expecting somebody to build a bridge. And you know, I've got all the school kids in the bus, and you're driving the bus, you know, as fast as you. I'm the guy responsible for the bus, and you're going to drive it off the cliff, unless, of course, you build the bridge in time. And guess what? So I resigned, because that was what I thought I had to do, because I couldn't sign off on his business plan. Guess what? He built the bridge. He sold the company for a lot of money. He made money. The fund made money, and he went on to be more successful. But at that particular point in time, in terms of my role and my view of my integrity in corporate governance, I left. Again, I lost another job. And then, out of nowhere, I got a phone call, and Hodorkovsky and Platon Lebedev asked me if I'd be the chairman of Menatep. And suddenly I went back in. I mean, each of these times I actually physically left the country. I mean, I'm having my 20 years in Russia anniversary in November, and one of the people that will be there, who's become a close friend, is the guy that physically moved me out of the country. I mean, he was just the guy doing the moving, but he did it 5 times. Actually did it more than 5 times, because he had to bring me back, so he's done it 10 times. I was physically out of the country, and I ran in again, and this is obviously, Hodorkovsky became something he didn't want to do. Hodorkovsky was in jail. I couldn't actually leave the country at that time around, because I was on a list, because I was working for Hodorkovsky, so there's no point in me trying to leave the country. It turned out that that was a good thing, because actually Deripaska turned up. And, you know, again, I had lost one job, and I found another job. Deripaska, at the end of 2007, said, thank you very much, Stuart, but you're now out of here. Again, I packed up, I left Russia. And again, sitting somewhere, I can't remember where I was, I think it was in France, sitting in France, I got a phone call, would you come in? And I got the job at HSBC, and I came back. Now, finally, I thought, oh, look at this is terrific. I've started at Citibank, I went through the sort of long grass with the Russian oligarchs and everything. Now I'm back inside a global bank. This is where I need to be. Boy, does this feel great. We opened 5 branches, we opened the private bank, and they tell me that we have to close. And so here I am again, I've just lost another job. I mean, I'm standing on the boat's just sunk. You know, I was there, I hired 400 people, I opened the branches, I did a great job, it was great PR, I felt totally in my element. And then they decided globally that they didn't want to be in Russia anymore, and they said, okay, now we're closing. So what was I going to do? Well, I can tell you, I again physically left the country, moved all my stuff to France, thought, well, that was a pretty good run, that was the end of that. And then I sat in the garden in France, I drank a huge amount of rosé, and I felt very sorry for myself. Because I said, oh, you know, look at this, you know, there I was, I had all this experience, I just did exactly what they wanted me to do, and through no fault of mine, you know, the bank closed, and here I am sitting in France, disconnected from a country that I love. What am I going to do? And for 3 months, I just felt sorry for myself. Actually, it was more than that. It was that I was meant to be receiving a phone call from the chairman of one of the big state banks, who was meant to be calling me to come back and have an interview to maybe go work for one of the big state banks. And I literally, I mean, it's almost, I didn't literally, but it was like the phone was there and I was like waiting for the phone to ring. And of course, you know, in the way that these things are, it didn't ring for 2 months. Finally it rang and I went back for an interview and I didn't get the job. But in that process, during that process, I had a friend there in France who said, you know what? All you're doing is talking about the past. Your vocabulary is entirely in the past tense. I used to do this, I used to do that, I was this, I was that. And she said, unless you can start thinking into the future, you will become that person from the past, because you will become that bitter individual who is constantly remembering the things that you used to do, not the things that you can do. And you know, at that point, actually, if you physically looked at me, I was suntanned, I was sitting in France, you know, it looked pretty good on the outside. But the reality was that I had no self-respect and I had no ability and by the way, we're not talking about long ago. You see, when I give this class, it makes it sound as though somewhere along the line I learned how to deal with this stuff. But actually, you know, right up until 2010, I still had the same negative reaction to what I perceived as failure. And of course, I was externalizing. It wasn't my failure, it was somebody else's failure. And she convinced me and you'll see it in the presentation, turn my head around. You know, it was like physically I had my head on backwards and I was looking backwards all the time and I wasn't looking to where I should go. So I called a friend of mine that ran the Emir's Bank in Kuwait. Now Kuwait is not a natural kind of, you know, it's not my idea of an island paradise, let's say. You know, but the point was that there was a job there that could be done. And rather than sitting and feeling miserable and you know, not doing anything positive, I went off to Kuwait and I spent 2 or 3 months working for this bank, doing advisory for the CEO, and it gave me back a future. It put my mind back into the perspective of not regretting my past, but looking to the future. And then I had agreed to do a course at Skolkovo. And I did the first risk course for the first MBA, so I had to come back to Russia. And when I was back in Russia, I had regained my ability to look forward, and when I ran into the senior partner of Ernst & Young, that's when this opportunity happened, and I've been there ever since. And the moral of the story is that it's perfectly okay to feel regret, to go through this pit of, you know, despair, let's call it. But you've got to get your head back around, because there's no point in trying to move forward unless you've got a forward-looking perspective. So I found 6, you know. So and that's the point: is that it's not being this easy ride. And most careers, I have to say, Dan sounds different to me, but then Dan's a different kind of guy. Dan has positioned himself where he's so open, and that his approach has been so positive. That I believe, actually I forgot to ask him, but I do believe he's never been in a position where he's completely unemployed, because he's just, people have found him along the way. And as he says, people have found him and asked him to stretch himself in ways that at that time he didn't even think he could do. I mean, running a power company when you come from the financial industry isn't a natural thing to do. And when he was running that power company, I know because he's told me, he didn't see that as going to the job that he's got. He just thought that was an interesting job. And it was only because the CEO actually decided to retire, or move, he then got put into the position where he was more visible, and it was because when he was more visible that they decided to promote him. So, this thing about when you least expect it you will fail is, I wouldn't make it like, it sounds like a bit of a threat. It sort of sounds like, well, you wait. When you least expect it, failure will come. It's not like that. But it is, in my experience, quite often, it comes from a clear blue sky. It comes when you know, if you saw the failure coming, you'd probably avoid it. So actually, the failure that I'm talking about, the one that hurts the most, the one that deals you the body blow, is the one you don't see on the horizon. So you go from, and this was me, I was flying on a G4, I was with the chairman, and then suddenly, after 25 years, there was, thank you very much. Actually, they delivered the grandfather clock, because at 25 years in Citibank you get the clock. They delivered it to my home the day so it was 25 years, I just lost my job, my marriage had just fallen apart, and I was physically moving out of the house. So I just gave the clock back to the movers. But, you know, so this 25 years had, you know, suddenly disappeared on me. And you feel like you're on the spin cycle in a washing machine, or you feel like you're a mushroom where you live in the dark and people shovel shit on you. So it's basically this particular point in time, I'm not going to pretend that this isn't an extremely unpleasant process. The point of what I'm going to talk about isn't that I think I can avoid that feeling. It's that how you deal with that is going to be very important. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So we've already done this, which is our leaders born or bred. And this, I'm getting to how to deal with a failure. Before I get there, I want to talk about characteristics. So we've already gone through how some of these skills that we've talked about as leadership skills, we can sit in a room and I can talk to you about them. However, others, and there's a much longer list as you've seen, these are the characteristics of leadership. These are, so it was perfectly clear in Dan's conversation what his characteristics are. And as I've explained to you before, in my opinion, it's like going to a buffet, you know, where you've got lots of different food. As a leader, if you don't have a tray, which is integrity, authenticity, if you don't have that tray, you're not going to have anything to put these different characteristics on. But what characteristics you actually add to that core authenticity and integrity vary according to individuals, and may come into focus and may go out of focus according to business cycles or the jobs that you're in. Whatever it is, it doesn't mean it's a fixed set of characteristics. It just means that there are a set of these characteristics. And then the question is, well, you know, how do you develop these characteristics? And the whole point of my class, the whole point of the stuff I talk about leadership, isn't to try and teach you the characteristics. Because, as I say, characteristics are how you live your life, not how I've lived my life. The reason it's worth talking about these things is so that you become aware of what these characteristics are and how you acquire them. So, this brings me to the concept of crucible. And this isn't my idea, so I don't want to. This is actually, you know, I was thinking about how do I talk about this process, and I ran across this idea of the crucible. And actually, the crucible. Does anybody know what a crucible is? No, it's a melting. Well, yes, but it was more specific in the old days. A crucible. Well, alchemists, you know, they'd pour lead in, and then they'd heat it up, and it'd become gold. I mean, that was a sort of Middle Age kind of, you know, that was the fairy tale of the crucible. And the concept, so the fairy tale brought into this situation is that you go in as one base metal and you come out, you know, as valuable. And the concept of the crucible is that we all have every day an experience that changes us. Everything that you do, every person you interact with, every situation that occurs to you will change the person that you are. But occasionally, we go through these very intense processes, and they don't cause a marginal change in who you are, but they actually quite fundamentally change who you are. And there's no guarantee that you get through them. I mean, the point about the crucible is actually, unfortunately, as in life, there's no guarantee. As in the crucible, if you go into one of these intense experiences, you may come out of it stronger, with greater courage, with greater authenticity, and move on to the future. Or it may break you, and you may lie, you may become, you know, a bad person, you may become a drug addict. You know, the crucible, it doesn't mean it has a happy ending. It just means it's an intense experience. So it's a transformational experience. And it will change who you are fundamentally. It will give you, if you survive it, it will give you the ability to understand these very tough environments and also to be able to communicate them. I mean, I think this concept of a better understanding of yourself. You see, it's quite interesting when you listen to Dan. Here's a guy who knows himself very well. You know, when you heard him talk, this isn't a guy that has never looked in the mirror properly. He knows who he is, and he deals, and he plays to his strengths, and he blocks against his weaknesses. And this crucible experience is part of that. And of course, if you've gone through this intense experience, you can't talk about this stuff unless you've gone through it. Which is why sometimes when I talk about this with undergraduates, it's a very tough conversation because they've never really gone through what I'm talking about here. And therefore, as I talk about it, they have difficulty imagining it. Hopefully it's up to you to decide whether or not I've got a distinct and compelling voice. But generally, if you've gone through these experiences, you can talk about it. If you talk to these you know, I call them nuts, but I mean they're explorers. You know, they go to the top of Everest, or they go to the North Pole, or they cross the Atlantic or the Pacific. You know, when they talk, they can talk, and you can feel it. Because they're able to communicate well, if they're good communicators, they're able to communicate what it was, the experience that they went through. Adaptive capacity. One of the characteristics that I have heard, because I've done this chat with CEOs many times, and one of the things I've heard as a consistent message is you can't afford to have to be too rigid. You have to be able to adapt to situations. If you refuse to adapt, you become brittle. If you're brittle, you'll break. So the point here is to learn how to adapt and change with the changing environment. Another absolutely core characteristic to leadership is perseverance, courage, the ability. Because you see, the thing about this failure is it takes courage to get the other side of it. If you give up, if the crucible breaks you, you give up on your future, you give up hope, you give up looking to a more positive outcome. And then the one thing that, you know, I've said, I think before, is I can't tell you how to have, I can't promise you good luck, but I can tell you how to have bad luck. I mean, luck, by its nature, is, you know, random. And therefore I can't sit here and say to you, well, you know, I can promise you you'll be lucky. You may not be lucky. You may go through your whole life and you may be unlucky. But there are certain things that you do which will cause bad luck to happen to you. You know, you can be inflexible. You can be, you can be arrogant. You can be. There's certain things that will, certain types of characteristics that will kind of like be a bad luck magnet for you. So it's better that you avoid those things. So this crucible allows you to transition from the past to the new reality. Now, not all crucibles, because actually not all of these intense experiences are the same. You have basically three. And of course you can come up with more. I mean, this is just the framework that I think works for me anyway. The first crucible is generally a positive one. Basically what it means is that you're put into a situation that you weren't in before, that stretches you, hugely stretches you. It's tough, it requires you to work hard, it may cause you to have to learn new skills. It's something, now for instance for me, it was obvious. August the 2nd, 1982, I wake up, I'm running the corporate bank in Kenya, and suddenly there's a coup. You know, and you've read my case study. That was a new crucible. I can't tell you that it was particularly enjoyable. It was incredibly demanding. But the fact is that it allowed me to my character to move forward. And actually, of course, it then was the key to Citibank giving me this role as a crisis manager and moving me around the world and putting me always into the most difficult situations, which allowed me to really grow in my career and maybe in my personal characteristics. So it's a very positive event. The next one, I'm afraid, is not so positive. Because the next one is the reversal. This is the clear blue sky, and actually normally there is a progression. Normally what happens is you go through the first crucible, you survive it, you get promoted. Maybe you go through another crucible, you go through that, you survive it, you get promoted. And then, at some point in time somewhere out there, for different reasons, you fail. And this failure crucible, which is, it's a significant and negative event, it impacts you in a way that this is bad for your health. The reversal, if not handled properly, allows you to become introverted, forces you into a negative perception of yourself, causes you to withdraw, and frankly, you during that period, if you don't deal with it properly, you've kind of lost the plot. And this is where people get derailed. And when I look at the things that have happened to me, and I'll talk about them. When I went through this process, I'll talk about one of them now. So here I'm a perfect example of the reversal, of the failure. My new crucible was crisis management, and I went from the Kenya coup to Egypt to Norway. I then did 5 years of corporate finance very well. They then gave me Italy, and I did the crisis in Italy in '93. I was in the top 10% of Citibank, and then I was on the plane, and then they gave me my big reward. And because I had been the guy, I'd been their gladiator. I had been the guy that they sent when things fell apart. They just like a grenade. They pulled out the pin, they threw the grenade in, bam. Within a year and a half, it was solved, and then they gave me. What they would do is they give me the crisis, and then they give me a little sort of pat on the back, a recovery period. So that was Kenya, then Athens recovery, then Egypt, then Paris recovery, then Norway, and then we went through corporate finance. But what they were doing is that they were constantly reinforcing that I was successful. Now, the problem about these skills that I acquired was that they were the skills of crisis management. Every situation that I was put into, there was a really big issue, a really big problem. And the problem was from the management team that I was being parachuted in. So what would happen is that they'd fire. Well, there was two parts to this that I analysed afterwards that created my management style. The first was that they would fire my predecessor because he'd just lost money or he'd lost control of the business. Whatever it was, I would arrive into an empty seat where the guy had been taken out and shot, as it were. So I knew that whatever it was that I was inheriting, because that was why I was there, was a problem. And I knew that the problem came from my predecessor and my predecessor's management team. But worse than that, I also knew, because I was the number two, I was the corporate bank head, I also knew that my boss was part of the problem too. Because I was put into these roles by his boss. So it was the level above country management that put me in as the number two for the corporate business. And I reported to a guy who I had no respect for, because I had been parachuted in to solve the problems that had occurred in the business. Well, of course, and I was very successful. So I could analyse, as a crisis manager, you analyse the environment, you create an action plan, you force change, you reinforce the need for momentum, and you don't take prisoners, because you don't have time. And when Dan was talking during his conversation about how it is that sometimes you don't have the time, the luxury of time, well, in a crisis, by definition, you don't have the luxury of time. And so all of my management skills related to a highly authoritarian change management style with deep levels of insubordination to my direct boss, because he was always a part of the problem. And Citibank kept giving me bigger and bigger jobs until eventually I was running the corporate business in Italy. And then, guess what? Then they give me this job to run Citibank in Russia. And nobody put me on a course like this. Nobody sat me down and said, there's a line here between how you've been running the businesses before and what we expect you to do in the future. So they put me into this job, into this role, CEO of Citibank Russia, the first operative CEO. The first thing I do is I look around and I take my toolbox, which is, by the way, full of tools by now, because I've been 20 years in the business of crisis management, and they're my trusty tools. I know what I'm going to do. None of them involved leadership. All of them involved management. And I was able to establish a very strong relationship with the young Russian staff. That was fine. But between me and the young Russian staff, there was this my direct reports. And back in '95, Citibank, as it was being set up, there were no bankers in Russia, because bankers were communist bankers. They were irrelevant to our business plan. So we had to bring in expatriates from all over the world. And back in '95, Russia wasn't kind of like the place anybody really wanted to go to, you know, shootings and this and that and the other. So we didn't get the A team, I'm afraid. We got the people that we could get, but they knew a lot about banking and nothing about Russia, like me. And we were putting them on top of young Russians who were keen, like sponges, very, very bright, very customer-oriented. We'd hire the concierge in the hotel because there weren't bankers. We'd hire smart graduates. But immediately I had a problem with my management team, my expat management team. Because immediately I moved into crisis mode and I wasn't listening to what they were telling me, I was telling them what to do. Because that's what I'd done my whole career. And that built up a level of frustration amongst my management team. And then guess what? My boss and I, because I was used to not agreeing with my boss and I got into some big arguments. I don't want to get into what they were. And I could make the mistake at this point of saying, oh, and by the way, he was demoted immediately after I was removed. But it's irrelevant, because the fact is that I was removed. I got a phone call 2 years into my assignment, and the phone call was from him to say, for personal planning reasons, pack, you're fired. I mean, that was the phone call. And as far as I was aware, I was like a hot deal. I was doing exactly what I'd done in all the other countries. I had delivered the business plan. I thought I had some problems with these expats, but my relationship with the Russians was great. My relationship with the central bank was great. My relationship with the customers was great. But you know what? I had created enough instability amongst my direct management team and my management style, and I created enough negativity with my boss that between the two of them, they'd gone off and worked on a plan, and I was fired. Now, I was 23 years into Citibank. I was one of their most, I was a very high-profile guy. And it came from really, literally nowhere. And this was the time I had a very interesting meeting, because, you can imagine the experience of, you just get the phone call, and for personal planning reasons, you're fired, pack. So I called in a favour, and I went to see my boss's boss, who was the head of the emerging markets, all of them. And I went to see him in Heathrow Airport, and we had an hour and a half together. And in that hour and a half, I had to plead my case as to why I had done what I'd done, what I believed was the real situation. And it was at that point that he gave me, I'm not sure if I've told you the story, I'll tell it again anyway. He told the story. He said, listen, Stuart, for 20 years, you were our most effective gladiator. We sent you into some of the most difficult fights anywhere in the world, and you always emerged bloody but successful. And then we gave you Caesar's job. And Caesar's job is to sit above the gladiator ring and look at the fights, and maybe at the end of the fight go like that. Right? That's your job. You've got to motivate, you've got to lead. But you know what happened? Every single time there was a fight down in the gladiator ring, you were meant to be Caesar, but you jumped back into the ring, you took out your sword, and you were fighting everybody in the forum, because that was the way that you had got to that position. And it was a really fundamental understanding, not immediately, but I understood absolutely afterwards that that's exactly what I did. I couldn't leave behind the skills that had taken me to that position, and I hadn't drawn the line between management and leadership. And then they said, okay, so now we're going to move you to Puerto Rico. Well, you can imagine, here I was, one moment I was the head of Russia, and the next moment I'm the head of, can't find it, the Puerto Rico. And and by the way, not only was this kind of like a move, but it was incredibly public in Citibank. Because one moment the CEO, I was in all the conferences and this and that, and the next moment, with my tail between my legs, I'm out and I'm sitting in the sun in Puerto Rico thinking, it doesn't get worse than this. Now, the deal I did with the bank was, I said, I will go through this. I will go through counselling every month in Washington for a weekend. I will go through intense 360-degree reviews where everybody told me what I was like every 5 minutes. Pretty good. But you have to put me back into the group of 300 people that run Citibank. And that was the deal. And sure enough, I went through the process, and sure enough, I get back into the group of 300. And I think, okay, problem solved. At that point, and I'd also worked out, obviously the boss that hired me this time in Puerto Rico was hiring me, warts and all, problems and all. He knew everything about me, and he was a good guy. There was no crisis, so I actually had a good relationship with him. That was great, except he got promoted, and a new guy came in. Now, it's rather specific to Puerto Rico, but the fact is, at that particular point in time in Puerto Rico, I said this is an island that's bankrupt. It has no services, it's not creating any value added, and this is a country that just knows how to borrow, and we need to stop lending. And I agreed that with my boss. My new boss was a Puerto Rican. And I can still remember the moment where I'm standing up in front of all my staff, and I've basically outlined my business plan, and I've said, you know, we're going to cut back on our risk, we're going to, you know, decline a number of these lending opportunities, and my boss comes in, and he's like, you know, he's Puerto Rican, and he's like, we're going to double the portfolio, it's nothing but sunshine and happiness. And we come off the stage, and I say to the guy, look, you know, I can't do this. You know, I've told you what I believe professionally, and of course this was, you know, hit number 2. So hit number 1 was Moscow. Hit number 2 was Puerto Rico. My boss said, get this guy out of the bank, and I was out 25 years later. And you know, it's sort of, I still fight the urge to say, oh well, you know, these are the reasons, and it wasn't really my fault, and you know, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, I participated strongly in my own demise. And when I left Citibank, it was because I had been the Praetorian Guard. I had been their gladiator. It was extremely painful. So reversal is a very unpleasant process. And I've only talked about one here. Well, actually, there was 2. But both of them left me in a situation that... and then I'm not going to leave you with that idea. The idea is that I have a plan. So hang on. So the third type of crucible is the one that I'm going through now. The one that I've actually just been through. And, you know, this is suspension. It requires a period of introspection. It's normally caused by an external event. And it can be life-altering. And this suspension, the core message of suspension is, life isn't going to be the same going forward as it was in the past. And if you cling on to the past, you're going to miss all those opportunities ahead of you. I had a very interesting session I was teaching in Perm this weekend. And there was a group of students that were allowed to ask questions before I went and gave the main lecture. And the first question I got on a Saturday morning in Perm was, Mr. Lawson, when you were a young man, what were your dreams and did you fulfill them? That was okay. And then, and Mr. Lawson, what are your dreams now? And you know, you're a long way away from not having that kind of concept of, well, what are my real dreams? But I could talk very easily about what my dreams were and whether I'd achieve them or not. But constantly allowing yourself to have dreams is a critical part of being positive and in the world. And suspension is part of the way that you get there. So in my case, for instance, my role is, you know, boy, do I want to be Dan. I mean, I'd quite like to be Dan 10 years younger, but I mean, you know, I want to be Dan dealing with all these issues, dealing with all of these executive decisions, having that role, having a major role in business. But I don't have that anymore. I'm an advisor in EY. You know, I'm used for various things, but frankly, I have no major commercial issues on my desk. But you know what I've done? I've replaced it by what I'm doing now. And what I've done is I've actually found a way of parking my prior experience, being proud of it, but being able to move on. And so this suspension thing, this suspension crucible, luckily, generally, it comes to you rather later. And by the time you get to this suspension crucible, you're in better shape to manage the process. But it does require you to let go. Okay, so here are some of my many failures. By the way, you know, reversals, or these reversal crucibles, you know, it's not this, life is more than what you do at the office. And it can be, you know, these reversals can occur in relationships, with health, moving, you know, problems with kids, all of these things cause a sense of failure. So so I can't leave, okay, thank you all very much. It's been a wonderful time, I must now leave. You know, you're welcome to your life, good luck. So this is, these are some of my takeaways from, you know, what I've learned in this process. I had to copy pictures, so you can see that one of these people is feeling rejected. So, self-worth comes from self-esteem. You know, it's on the one hand, I don't want to make the point here that you should ignore what other people think of you. I mean, that's not true. What other people think of you is pretty relevant. But if you don't have high self-esteem, if you don't have your own self-esteem, it's going to be very difficult for you to generate authenticity and to have a sense of self. So rejection means, you know, understand what your strengths and weaknesses are, and understand that if you're going through this period of reversal, it's not a judgment on you as a person. It's a judgment on you perhaps as a professional. It may be a judgment on you as part of your characteristics, but it's no reason to lose self-esteem. The problem with that is it's easy to say and difficult to do. And actually, when you've gone through a reversal, actually one of the front end, you know, major issues is you lose your self-esteem. But sometimes it's necessary to ignore the views of others, and also it's necessary to see, you know, who's doing what and why. Some people have other agendas, and you may be responding to them with your agenda, but they have a completely different agenda. So Mum and Dad, did God create other people so we'd have someone else to blame for all our problems? You know, there is the responsibility of your actions. And I have to say, this is a very, very human thing, which is, and I still catch myself, even as I talk about it today, wanting to blame, you know, my boss or my subordinates or the environment or HSBC's group corporate board or whatever it is. But the fact is that you have to take responsibility for your actions, and if there is a failure, it will almost always have you as part of that equation. And if you allocate the blame to everybody else, which I did the first time around, by the way, I really did, especially in the Citibank Russia case, that you actually, you lose the fundamental thing here, which is that you learn from your mistake. If you think it's everybody else's mistake, well, what's to learn? You just keep doing what you were doing before and everything will be fine, because this wasn't your mistake, it was someone else's. They may have participated, but were they really the cause? This is where you have to be truthful. Next up, and here's a guy that's, you know, he's going to mow his lawn no matter what. Failure is temporary, it will pass. You know, when you're in that process of failure, when you're actually in the moment, it looks as though it's a bottomless pit. It looks as though it'll never end, the pain will never end, you can't see the other side of it. And actually, this is just really just life, is that provided you can get your head around it, and you can start thinking in a positive way and not living in the past, it will be a temporary thing. But it won't feel like it at the time. And during this period where, you know, you will go, it's like one of my good friends, he was promoted to the head of the investment bank for Royal Bank of Scotland, the biggest bank in Europe. Well, it's not anymore, but it was. And within 6 weeks he was fired, because he got into a big fight with the CFO. He's actually still not rehired by anyone. He will go back in as the CEO of a big company. There is no doubt in my mind. And meantime, he set himself the goal of swimming the channel. You know, he took control of the things that he could take control of. And if he couldn't be in control of his career, because a certain amount of time had to pass, he took control of the things that he was in control of, which was his personal fitness, the way he approached his day, how he managed his time, he did some traveling. They're short term, but they stop you from allowing yourself to fall deeper into the pit. Personally, I love writing things out. I mean, I started writing a journal when my son was born 17 years ago, and I did it for him. He'll never read them, I'm sure, but I did it for him. I wanted to put things down on paper, because actually when my father died, I knew nothing about him as a young man. And so my son's never going to have that excuse. If he wants to know who I am, he can read 17 years of journals. I mean, in these situations, just being able to share it honestly with someone, which is yourself, is actually a good way of getting it out of the system. I mean, it varies from person to person. This is what works for me. Go to the gym, pull and walks. Oh, talk to a close circle, but don't be a bore. I mean, you know, there's this thing, that good friends are there in times of need. They're not good. If the good friends are there only in good times, they're not good friends. So, you know, good friends are there as a support network during these periods. But you've got to understand that if every single time you see them, you go on and on and on about how miserable your life is and how it's unfair and nobody's talking to you and why did they, I should have been the chairman and you know, you can do it once, you can do it twice, but for Christ's sake, after that get a dog or a cat or a budgerigar and talk to the budgerigar. Because people, we all eventually, oh that's something else I was going to raise and I forgot to do it with Dan. It wasn't just that you should have this external circle as broad as possible. It is that you should remove negative people from your lives. If somebody is negative and causing negative reaction to you and they never have anything positive, and that, you know, remove them from the people that you hang out with. Don't surround yourself with negativity because it's contagious. I absolutely love it. Set realistic expectations. You know, I'm not going to be on a basketball team next week, no matter how much I'd like to. I mean, you've got to. Oh no, that's not it. So if you now, on the one hand, I'm not going to be on the basketball team, but on the other hand, if I don't create stretch goals, if I don't create realistic goals, you should constantly challenge yourself. Of course, you don't have to. You can decide that, you know, you don't need to challenge yourself. You could be perfectly happy, and you could, you know, plateau. But then don't expect sort of forward movement. If you've decided that I don't think anybody should ever, until they die, think that they've got it all done. I think you know, life is about improving year after year, but reachable goals. And by the way, if you create realistic goals, when you get there, it feels good. It's like caffeine, you know. It's sort of, which is very bad for you, but it makes you feel, you know, good. So it reinforces positive behaviour. I build on strengths, not weaknesses. You know, I mean, one of the things I had Piotr Schmieder, who's the chairman of Alpha Bank, come and do what Dan did. And one of the things that he said was, you know, if he had a management team and he had one person that sort of was the holdout, he would simply, you know, he'd give them enough time and then he'd get rid of them. And what I realized was that the way I went about it was I was constantly trying to convince everybody in the room that what my plan was the right plan. But the fact is that in spending so much time with people that weren't ever really going to get on board, I lost time with people who wanted to support me. And, you know, I think in general you should find things that you can build on, the positive things. You know, be aware of the weaknesses, but build on the positive side. If you continue to obsess on the negatives, it's all this thing about, I guess it's karma. I don't know enough about karma and stuff, but it's basically, if you are positive in the way that you approach life and people, then life and people will be positive in response. This is the sign that I suggested that you should remember, which is vary your approaches. If you do the same thing exactly again, which I did, by the way, several times, you're going to get the same output. Same input, same output. So whatever you need to, wherever you run into a problem, at least stop long enough and say, okay, what was the reason behind that, when things went wrong, and how can I vary my approach so that the next time round it isn't, I'm just not going to repeat the cycle. By the way, not necessarily, it isn't as easy as, oh, it went wrong the first time, so I instantly know how I can deal with it in the future. But if you vary approaches, then that will help. This is to say, build a strong external network. I think we've already covered it. It reflects your personalities and interests. You know, but if possible, completely remote from work environment. And by doing that, you create a suspension system in your life, which means that when things get out of control in your work environment, you're not forced to constantly confront that, because then it's not being reinforced. It's actually a way of you dispersing stress. And as I mentioned in crisis management, you don't build relationships when you need them. You build relationships when you don't need them, and then when you need them, they're there. So don't think that you can, you know, you water the plant every day. You don't water the plant when you want it to grow, you water it every day. And these relationships that you create, you have to be prepared. I mean, there's part of my idea of the favor bank. The favor bank is that you do things for other people, not as a negotiation, but as something that is done from you to them with no expected sense of return. And that life being circular, it'll find a way of coming back to you. In this strong group of friends, be available to them in good times and bad. Get back in the game, but make sure your head is pointed. This is from The Omen, I think it's an old film. But, you know, her head is turned around. The Omen was an old horror movie, and her head does a 360-degree turn. It's a kind of scary moment. Was it The Omen? I think it was The Omen. The point here is that I remember in 2000, obviously in 2000 when I lost my job at Citi and I was going through all this kind of personal stuff, I was desperate to get another job. And so I immediately rushed off to the headhunters and I said, I've got to find another job, you know, right away, you know, while I'm still hot. Of course I wasn't hot. So I went to, I actually had a meeting with the HR director of HSBC in North America. And no relation to the previous, you know, the subsequent job at all. That was, this was just for capital markets in North America. And I go into this interview and I'm doing the best, I know I'm doing well, I'm getting all the points across, and he goes, after 20 minutes, he goes, okay, you can stop now. He said, I've been in this business for 15 years, I have never, ever come across a candidate as bad as you. You have managed to hit all the things you shouldn't do in the first 20 minutes in this interview. You have badmouthed your predecessors, you've blamed everybody else, you've told me about your divorce, you brought in your personal life. He said, look, I've got a recommendation for you. What you need to do is you need to go away long enough that you've got rid of all of this negativity, you've managed to understand that you've got to project a positive point of view and then come back. But whatever you do, if you're carrying all this baggage and you're in the process of the spin cycle of the reversal, don't try and re-engage too soon. Allow yourself the space to get over it. But get back in the game. Don't look back, look forward. This thing about eating humble pie was a big problem for me because I had been constantly, my whole self-perception had been constantly reinforced as successful throughout a 23-year career at Citibank. And that's it. Bounce back, resilience is the key. Well, I've got some quotations, I think. Failure is a wonderful opportunity to up your game, provided you learn the lessons it's offering. If I find 10,000 ways something won't work, I haven't failed. I'm not discouraged because they're wrong attempts, because every wrong attempt discarded is a step forward. It is impossible to live life without failing at something unless you live so cautiously you might as well not live at all, in which case you fail by default. Winston Churchill failed 6th grade at school and was defeated in every election he ran for in public office. I'm not sure. Maybe that is true. I think he actually was appointed. Keep calm and bounce back. There you are. Some practical advice. Reactions, comments? Yeah.
If it's something like suspension, I think people also like traveling. It's just.
Yeah, it's one of the things. It's a thing to do. Yeah, be out in the world. There's no need to. Don't be confined by a geographic space. And if you're in one of these sort of cycles, it's an opportunity to do the things you hadn't had time to do when you were fully occupied.
Like studying, for instance.
Well, like studying. I mean, or if you've got I listen to Dan. I've never heard him play the guitar, but I think this thing about find a new interest, or emerge, really get into another thing that you wouldn't otherwise have found. I think really a lot of this is about positivity. It's about being prepared to accept responsibility, to absorb it, and then to be positive looking forward. No comments?
It looks like the movie with I think it's Tom Hanks, where the day repeated every day.
Oh, the Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's absolutely the same. As soon as you find a new positive ways, it changes.
Yeah, and life follows, and follows positivity. And by the way, unfortunately, the other way around. If you bring negativity in, and if you bring the same arrogance in, and you know, funnily enough, things fall apart again.
And maybe you could describe the situation about this when you're parachuting, as you said, in this problem branches in different countries. So kind of did you communicate it with this boss? He probably did.
The direct boss or the boss's boss?
No, direct boss, because as I understand, he has probably also the fear that you could replace him if the things would be okay. And yeah, he probably understands that you've come to take out all these problems that he has made with the team. And I mean, because I have the situations like this, my friends now have in their companies, and the guy, this boss, is very, I would say, obnoxious. He's very trying, just not letting you do any job. I mean, he's yelling, he's trying to, to stop you. If you try to fire somebody, you can fire, but after this you cannot put your guy there to do the work, and so it's a big pressure. What was your situation specifically, and how did you manage this?
Well, first of all, don't forget I was part of a global organisation. So in any global organisation, as I mentioned to you before, you have a lot of matrix management, and you have a web. So yes, there's the boss, the country head, but under the country head you have this whole external web of matrix. So as a corporate bank head, I had a boss somewhere else. As a treasury guy, I had a boss somewhere else. And you could, in risk, for instance, risk was always a huge part of my role, because I was clearing up bad portfolios mainly. My line to the risk was very strong. So let me just first of all explain that as I went into that role, it wasn't that I only had one telephone, and it only went to one person, which was I had all these telephone lines, all around the place, and therefore I had I had corporate support for whatever it was that I was doing. And unfortunately, it meant that I felt even more secure in my role, because I had the support from the global network to solve the problem. And the problem in Kenya was a relatively small problem, but by the time I got to Italy, it was a $4 or $5 billion problem. So it was a big old problem. Yes, from the moment I walked in the room, there was an inbuilt tension between me and the guy on the ground who was my boss, because he, of course, I don't think any of them saw me, because certainly at the beginning I was too junior, that I wouldn't have got their jobs anyway. I was a utility. I was being put in to deal with a specific issue in a certain time frame, which was very specific, and then I was always moved on. I mean, one of the things, the only way you can do 11 countries in 25 years is if you do them quite rapidly. I was put in, and the understanding was that I wasn't meant to establish relationships with external regulators, or with the clients, or even with my staff. I was there to do a very specific task. Once it was done, move on. So, to a certain extent, the CEOs took the view that they just had to hold their breath and I'd be somewhere else. The word went out that yes, this guy is, he's extremely efficient, he's pretty obnoxious, but he won't be there for very long. So their attitude generally was to let me do my thing and hope that I finished doing my thing within the span of time that they were still there, and then I'd be moved on before they were. So actually, from their point of view, they actually allowed me the space, frankly. It only became a problem when they had some initiative that was important to them, that they were trying to get me to then follow through on. As long as the only focus was on the cleanup and the reversal of the portfolio problems, it was fine. But the moment that there was a new initiative that they were then trying to impose on me, of course my attitude was, get out of here, I'm too busy doing my thing. And then friction would start. But generally their attitude was, he'll only be here for a short period of time, he's a particular utility, he'll sort it out. Of course they had to deal with all the wreckage when I left, you know, because I'd sort of beat people up, and the money would come back in, the process would get reimposed, and I would have caused all this kind of havoc in the relationships because I'd forced people to do things. But I was then moved on to the next environment, and then they could go through a healing process once I'd left. So I don't think I never solved that problem, except of course when it came. Well, actually, it was quite interesting when I worked for Deripaska, right? Well, I certainly wasn't going to win any battles with Deripaska. I think I understood that from day one. But there was, and I also understood in that role that I better follow what the shareholder wanted. Because unlike in a corporation, it's a publicly quoted corporation, it's owned by millions of people, then you've got the management board, and then there's lots of different personalities in the management board. If your company is owned by one individual, well, you better be on track with their risk appetite and strategy and point of view, because it's one person. So I understood that, but there was a layer of management between me and him. But the difference was that because that layer of management was fully empowered by him, I understood that there was no games to play, and therefore I had to establish a strong relationship with them. That was fine, except that we were constantly in conflict about some of the issues at the perimeter. And I have actually, one of the strongest relationships I have in business world is with my old boss, because what I discovered in Russia, and maybe it's true in others, but I never really got there, was that if you fight the good fight and you fight it with, under the rules, as it were, of the ring, and you come out, and even though you've been fighting each other, you shake hands afterwards, and actually they respect you for strength. I do think that's a characteristic in Russia, is that Russians respect people that have a strong position, hold to it, and then deliver. And they don't, and they take it, and it's actually seen in international politics now. They don't, if any weakness is perceived as weakness, and there's no allowance for weakness. I'm afraid that one of the Russian characteristics is win-lose. So this issue of, you see, one of the strengths in the American environment and venture capital is that you can be seen to try and fail, and it's not seen as that's it, game over. In America, it's very normal to try and fail, to go bankrupt, to come back, to do it again, because people on the edge of the risk curve, and venture capitalists are by their nature on the edge of the risk curve, are constantly, falling off it, because if they didn't stretch it all the way out, they wouldn't have the upside. If you want to keep the risk under control, you keep it back here, your return is limited, and your chance of failure is limited. If you push it out here because you want this huge return, you may fall over the edge. And I think Russia has a problem with this concept that you fail and you come back. You sort of either you're a winner or you're a loser, and it has to change that approach if it's going to foster venture capital and how it deals with entrepreneurs generally.
Thank you.
Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I mean, but in general, what do you recommend in this when it's like the closed organization? You don't have like such a global relations between some support. If you're kind of in a shit sandwich when one part is.
Well, you're the shit the other way around, where there's shit above, shit below, and you're in the middle.
Yeah. So I mean, what you can do on how can you kind of create some opportunities to manage this maybe, and I don't know how to manage this situation. What is the general focus?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's an important point to be made here, which is where are your boundaries? How do you define your boundaries? In other words, you can be asked, you can disagree with strategies, that's one thing, but if somebody asks you to do something that you think is against your core integrity, that's another thing. So, I think the only area where, the part that's up for discussion is where people ask you to do things you disagree with, but that don't fundamentally conflict with your sense of integrity. If people ask you to do things that conflict with your sense of integrity, you don't have a choice, you leave. I mean, it's up to you. I think we found out in the past that if you do what you're told just because you're told to do it, and it's against core principles, you will suffer at some point. So let's assume that that's not the case. Let's assume that you just have a disagreement. If you have a disagreement, I think Dan has this perspective which is really gold dust, which is that he said, think through what you really want to achieve. And if what you really want to achieve is somewhere over the horizon and you have to go through this process, keep your mouth shut. You know, if somebody's got a bad strategy and they're your boss, you make an argument, well, I think it isn't the right strategy. They say, I don't care, you do it. You document that and then you do what you're told, as long as it doesn't conflict with your core values. Because if you see my approach to this, because of my nature, actually, if I rewind, if you want the full kind of psychiatric profile, I was beaten up as a kid at boarding school, and I was sent to learn Aikido at the age of 10, and I did it for 8 years. And I learned, I mean, Aikido is all about moving other people's energy and so forth, but I learned how not to stand back. I mean, how to use other people's energy and stuff, but not to stand back. And that became part of my character. And so I was so effective as a crisis manager because I didn't stand back. I had this courage in me to push through, to push down the barriers. But the fact is, sometimes, actually, if you have a stable outlook on, you know, if you're in a more balanced environment and it isn't a crisis all the time, you don't have to win every war. My problem was that I got to every battle. Sorry, not every war, every battle. And my problem was that I got into this mentality where I couldn't lose a battle, even if I understood that tactically, strategically, maybe I should lose occasionally so that I could win the war. And I think that was a fundamental error for me. It was built into my character. And it wasn't built into Dan's character, I think.
So, I mean, Dennis, from your point of view, is much more diplomatic, yes? So he's kind of a...
Yes, I mean, well, you could feel it. You could feel it. He you know, I think, and he's ended up in a very, very senior role because he's prepared. He's very direct, as he says, but he understands that he understands communication is critical, but he doesn't need to win every war, every battle. I keep saying war, every battle, and I think that's made him much more successful. I think it's part of the key to his success. Yeah.
But for you, I mean, you said about your failures, but yeah, as I understand, it's if you do some, as we say in Russia, if you don't do nothing, you don't do mistakes, and if you do anything, you do mistakes.
Yeah.
So I mean, but you also, I mean, with your position that you said like a gladiator, you also kind of this is sometimes you need it. I mean, it also.
No doubt about it. And boy, it was, you know, I was an excellent gladiator. I mean, I did a really excellent job. And actually, one of my, you know, if I was being honest with you, the last 5 years, I have spent a lot of this last 5 years in introspection. You know, giving these classes, talking about leadership, bringing my friends along and listening to them talk about leadership, has given me a lot of insights into my own strengths and weaknesses. And a frustration that I have is that, you know, I feel as though give me one more bank and I'll really do a great job, you know. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, I actually found this 5-year period to be very, very productive for me because it's forced me to reassess my own, you know, my history, as it were, and has allowed me the opportunity to talk to a number of leaders, because when you're actually in a leadership role, you don't talk like this. I mean, you don't sit down with another CEO and say, well, tell me about your leadership stuff. You know them as, you know, people at your level, but we don't sit around having these sort of discussions as a CEO to CEO. It's only in this sort of environment that I can do that, and as a result of being in this, having this opportunity, it's given me this insight, which I would have so enjoyed if I'd had it earlier. So, first of all, I was very effective. Secondly, I was successful. Actually, let me tell you the story, which still makes me grin. Was this little lecture is kind of a personal lecture because you've got to be prepared to talk about failure and how you failed. And of course, it's quite difficult for people who are currently in CEO roles to talk about failure because they've still got their brand, and it wouldn't be terribly, you know, encouraging for my team if they listened to me you know, talking about failure, and they thought, oh Christ, we've got some guy that's a big, you know, that's failed. We want it to go a winner. So when I gave this lecture for the first time, I did it at Oxford, which is my old university, and I did it at the MBA school, the Said School. And I finished the lecture, and a hand went up, and I thought, God, this is fantastic. You know, I've really connected with people. And the question that was asked, my very first question after this lecture was, Mr. Lawson, that was very interesting, thank you very much for that. Shouldn't this just be called failure? Why do you call it successful failure? I mean, you used to be a CEO and now you're a teacher. Surely, actually, what happened here is that you just failed. Can you imagine? And I had to think about it because, and of course, the answer is, if my self-perception, my self-esteem was as a failure, if I really thought this was a failure, what would be the last thing that I would do? I mean, the last thing that I would do is talk about it. So you can only really share this sort of experience and be positive about it if you have re-established if you believe in what you've done as a body of work, and if you don't have a sense of failure, which I don't. And the more I teach, the more I realize that this part of my life, this process that I've gone through, is perhaps a valuable part of my life. Because it's, well, I don't know if you've learned anything or not over the last few sessions. Hopefully you've learned something. Certainly I enjoy the process, and to a certain extent I believe that I'm actually really passing on valuable experience, in which case it's an important thing for me to do. So that's my point of view on it.
Well, maybe do you think that failure is much more the inner?
Failure is a state of mind. Failure is a state of mind. That's why I say this thing about self-esteem. I think if your self-esteem if you have a self-image of failure, then the only thing I can tell you for sure is that you are a failure. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that you will. It'll come out through your pores. You'll sweat failure, because that authenticity that we talk about, in leadership, requires not arrogance, but it requires you to feel that you have something to offer, that you can contribute positively. If your inner sense is, I'm a failure, then everything else around you, it doesn't matter how you dress it up, how big your car is, how pretty your girlfriend is, how big your apartment is. Sorry, on the inside you're a failure, and that will come through. So I think, yes, it's a state of mind. Which is why it's so important to go through this process of absorbing the mistake and understanding it and changing how you approach life. That is very important. You know, Dan said it perfectly. The first failure is a mistake, the second one's a choice. And I think if there was, actually I should build that into this presentation because it's a great line. Any other questions or comments? I mean, it's a Saturday afternoon, you've had more than enough of me, yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a story how you crossed with Daniel?
Sorry?
How you met Daniel, how you just...
No, I mean, there isn't, we've been in business in Russia together for 20 years, and if you're in business in Russia for 20 years, you're going to run across people. I mean, and this thing about you walk out of one door and you walk into another, be respectful. We didn't really talk about the firing process. He and I talked about it a little bit over breakfast. Firing people is a difficult process, and the main thing you have to do during that process is be respectful about the person that's going through it on the other side. You have to allow enough time for them to have a point of view, you have to listen to what they have to say, and you have to respect them. And the number of times that I have run into people where, in this 20 years, who either I've had to fire, or who've been fired, or who've gone through bad times. I mean, almost every successful person I know has gone, actually, maybe not with, even with, now I think about it, Dan had a tough patch. We've all gone through these sort of waves of success and failure. And if you're too arrogant on the way up and too, if you milk success and you sort of drop your unsuccessful friends and you only talk to successful people, well, guess what? When you go into your valley, those people that you kind of ignored because you were too successful, they may be going through a counter-cyclical cycle. And now they're in a position of power and you're nowhere. And guess what? Do you think they're going to take your calls? No. So by the way, can I tell you one other thing which which I didn't introduce Vika. You may have wondered who Vika was. Vika is my cardiologist. Okay? Vika, I'll tell you the story of. Actually, can you kill? I'll tell you what. Let's kill it so that I can tell the story.